Section 1. The world that should not have survived. There is something quietly beautiful about stepping into a broken world and finding that people are still telling stories inside it. The Fallout series has been doing that for close to 3 decades now. From the bleached California desert of the first game, to the neon-soaked Mojave, to the green-gray fog of Appalachia, these games have always been about more than survival. They are about the residue of civilization, the things that persist when everything important has burned away. Somewhere buried inside all of that, buried under the rusted bottle caps and the cheerful propaganda posters and the 200-year-old cans of Blamco mac and cheese, there are mysteries that no one has ever fully explained. Some of them are small. A single terminal entry that ends mid-sentence. A skeleton in an unusual position with a note nearby that raises more questions than it answers. A building that should not exist, in a location that makes no geographical sense, with doors that lock from the outside. The kind of mystery you find by accident, while you are looking for something else entirely, and that stays with you long after you have moved on to the next quest marker. And some of them are enormous, world-shaping, the kind of questions that sit at the foundation of everything you know about the lore and quietly make it all feel just a little less stable. Questions about who made the world, what it is, and why, and whether the answer to that question is something you would want to know. This video is about both kinds. We are going to go slow. We are going to let them breathe. Because the best thing about Fallout mysteries is that they reward patience. The more time you spend with them, the more you notice. The more you notice, the stranger things become. So get comfortable. This is going to take a while. Before we get to the mysteries themselves, it is worth spending a moment with the world they live in. Because Fallout's setting is not just a backdrop. It is a participant in every question the series raises, and understanding it changes the texture of everything you find inside it. The war that ended the world happened on the 23rd of October 2077. That is a date every Fallout player knows. The Chinese and American governments launched their nuclear arsenals at one another, and within about 2 hours, the civilization that had been building since the Industrial Revolution simply stopped. Billions died. Most things died. The sky turned to ash and stayed that way for a very long time. What came after that is what the games explore. And the thing that makes Fallout's world interesting, the thing that gives it all that rich, decaying texture, is that the bombs did not kill everything at once. They killed most things. And then the things that survived had to figure out what to do with the wreckage, and what kind of society they wanted to build from it, and whether they even wanted society at all. 200 years after that war, the world the games take place in is a wild, impossible thing. There are ghouls who were alive before the bombs fell, and who are still walking around, weathered and strange, carrying memories of a world no one else can access. There are super mutants, which is what the forced evolutionary virus does to a human body when the conditions align. There are factions with philosophies about what the future should look like, all of them flawed, all of them interesting. And there are machines and programs that were built before the war and that have simply kept running, kept carrying out their original instructions long past the point when anyone told them to stop. The Great War happened, but it was not random. There are reasons for it. Competing pressures and decisions made by specific people in specific rooms. And some of those reasons have only recently begun to come into focus. Tim Kaine, one of the original creators of the Fallout universe, revealed in an interview with lore researcher TK's Mantis that the reason the war started traces directly to something called FEV, the forced evolutionary virus. The United States government had been secretly developing it, despite bioweapons being internationally illegal. China found out. They demanded the program be shut down. The US agreed publicly, but all they actually did was move the research. Relocated it, continued it somewhere else. When China figured out that the agreement had been a lie, the situation collapsed into nuclear exchange with a speed that suggests both sides had been waiting for exactly this kind of justification. So, the world ended because of a lie. Not just any lie, but a specific bureaucratic governmental lie. The kind where everyone in the room knows it is a lie, but they sign the papers anyway because the alternative is admitting to something they do not want to admit to. That is the world Fallout lives in, and that is the kind of answer that opens more questions than it closes. Because if the US was willing to go that far to protect FEV research. What exactly were they trying to do with it? What were they trying to build? And how much of what came after the war, the super mutants, the ghouls, the vaults, the experiments, how much of it traces back to whatever was in those labs before the bombs fell? We will come back to FEV more than once in this video because it runs through the entire series like a dark thread. It is the connective tissue between things that appear unrelated. But for now, let us start with something more immediate, something personal. Let us talk about the man who shows up out of nowhere to save your life, and then disappears before you can ask him why. Drop a comment below and tell me where in the world you're watching this from and what time it is there. And if you haven't subscribed yet, there's a button nearby that would genuinely help this channel keep going. Section 2. The Mysterious Stranger. A ghost in a trench coat. He appears without warning. You are in the middle of combat. Things are going badly. Enemies are closing in from angles you did not account for. Then time slows the way it does in VATS. And there he is. A man in a long, dark trench coat and a wide-brimmed hat, face hidden in shadow, a .44 Magnum in his hand. He fires once, sometimes twice. An enemy drops, then a guitar chord plays, 3 clean notes with a resonance that sounds like something out of a Western film, and he is gone. He does not explain himself. He does not introduce himself. He does not stick around long enough to be questioned. And the game gives him a name that is less a name than an acknowledgement of what he is. The Mysterious Stranger. He has appeared in every mainline Fallout game since the very first one in 1997. Fallout 1, Fallout 2, Fallout 3, New Vegas, 4, and 76. He is one of the most consistent presences in the entire series. And despite that, despite decades of appearances across multiple platforms and multiple different development teams, his identity has never been officially confirmed. That fact alone is striking, but it becomes stranger when you start noticing the details around him. In Fallout New Vegas, there is a character who camps near the El Dorado gas and service station north of the Strip. His name is the Lonesome Drifter, and he earns his living as a wandering musician, playing guitar and keeping to himself out in the open desert. He is a quiet, decent sort of person, and if you take the time to talk to him, he mentions his father. He says his father was a mysterious man. A man who was like a stranger even to his own family. A man who left when the Drifter was still very young, and who never came back. No explanation. No goodbye. Just gone one morning, and the mother said he was a real mysterious feller, even when he was there, and that the boy should not expect to understand it. The Lonesome Drifter carries a unique .44 Magnum revolver. He calls it the Mysterious Magnum. And when you draw the Mysterious Magnum, it plays the exact same guitar riff that plays every single time the Mysterious Stranger appears in VATS. 3 clean notes, exactly the same. Note for note, the sound is identical. This is not accidental. Obsidian Entertainment, the developers of New Vegas, are meticulous writers. They do not make these connections by accident. The implication is laid out carefully and with full intent. The Lonesome Drifter is the son of the Mysterious Stranger. The Mysterious Stranger is a father who abandoned his family to wander the wasteland saving strangers. He left his son a guitar and a gun in his absence, and the boy grew up carrying all 3. But that explanation, rather than settling anything, immediately creates entirely new questions. Because the Mysterious Stranger is not just an absent parent with a hobby. He is something more than that, and the longer you look at him, the less human he seems. Nick Valentine, the synth detective in Fallout 4, has a case file on the Mysterious Stranger. You can find it in his office, on his bed, a worn folder he has been building for years. Nick has been actively investigating the stranger, and he is certain that this man has been active in both the Commonwealth of Massachusetts and the capital wasteland of Washington, D.C., not the same region, separated by hundreds of miles. Both places confirmed, at roughly overlapping times. This is physically impossible for any ordinary human being. You cannot be in Washington and Boston simultaneously. You cannot age as slowly as the stranger appears to have aged while covering that kind of territory on foot, and yet Nick's files confirm both presences as genuine, documented encounters. The stranger also cannot be killed. In every game where he appears, he exists during VATS, combat sequences only. He phases in, he acts, he phases out. You cannot attack him. You cannot interact with him outside these brief windows. He registers no damage, leaves no body, generates no sounds of movement when approaching or departing. He simply materializes from nothing, does what he came to do, and ceases to be perceptible until the next time someone needs him. He does not appear to have a fixed location anywhere in any of the game's worlds. He has no home, no camp, no affiliation, no contacts. He exists only in the moment of intervention. Some players have suggested he is a ghost. This is worth taking seriously as a hypothesis rather than dismissing immediately, because the Fallout universe has established that genuine apparitions exist. Point Lookout in Fallout 3 contains haunted locations with spectral activity that is not explained by radiation or FEV. Fallout 76's Watoga contains spectral entities. The series takes the supernatural seriously enough that dismissing ghost theory as impossible would be missing the point of the world's architecture. If the stranger is a ghost, the story becomes something genuinely haunting in a way that goes beyond the standard wasteland horror. A man who lived by protecting strangers, who was so committed to that purpose that it outlasted his physical existence, who left behind a son who grew up carrying the only things his father ever left him, a gun and a song, neither of which he fully understood. The son wanders and plays music. The father wanders and saves lives. Neither of them knows the other is out there. Other players believe he is supernatural in a different way. An entity that exists outside normal physics, tied to some concept or force the series has not yet named. His appearance correlates directly with the player character's luck statistic, which in Fallout is a literal, quantifiable attribute that influences everything from combat to conversation outcomes to the probability of finding rare items. The higher your luck, the more often the stranger appears. This is presented as a game mechanic, but from a lore perspective, it is a deeply strange detail. What does it mean that this man is drawn to people with high luck? That he follows the thread of favorable probability and shows up at moments when the odds are balanced on a razor's edge? Is he a manifestation of luck itself, given form? A guardian angel whose presence is summoned by the concentration of good fortune, operating as the agent of that fortune rather than simply benefiting from it? The misfortune perk in New Vegas adds another layer. A woman in a veil and showgirl outfit who performs weaker, non-lethal attacks when she appears. She and the stranger never appear at the same time. They seem to be counterparts, or competitors, or two aspects of the same phenomenon. She has no backstory, no name that is acknowledged, no origin. She is simply there when the stranger is not, doing roughly the same thing with different methods. And the mysterious savior, also in New Vegas, wears identical clothing to the stranger, but heals rather than shoots. Same coat, same hat, different function. Whether this is the same person in a different role, or a different entity who found the same coat, or some kind of echo or variant of the stranger operating on a different frequency of intervention, the game simply does not say. What all of this accumulates into is a figure who has haunted the series since its beginning and who does not fit cleanly into any category the world of Fallout provides. He is too persistent to be coincidental, too consistent across games with different creative teams to be an error or a carryover, and yet he remains stubbornly, completely unexplained. The fan theories are numerous. One popular idea holds that the stranger is an escaped Institute synth from Fallout 4, a Gen 3 synthetic human who has been active long enough to develop a genuine personality and sense of purpose, and who has remained in operation since before the events of any game we have played. This would explain his agelessness, his ability to appear across great distances, his imperviousness to damage during VATS sequences. But it would also require him to have been active long before the Institute was producing Gen 3 synths at all, which creates a timeline problem that no theory has cleanly resolved. Another theory, popular among dedicated lore researchers, suggests that the stranger is the Vault Dweller, the protagonist of the original Fallout game, still alive and still wandering, 2 centuries after being exiled from Vault 13. The Vault Dweller was stripped of their home, forbidden from returning after saving the world, sent out into the wasteland alone. A person like that, with no home and no place to go, might spend decades wandering, might develop a habit of stepping in when things were about to go wrong, might become, over time, exactly what the stranger is. The age problem is real, but the Fallout universe has established multiple mechanisms by which people can outlive normal lifespans, from FEV to specific medical technologies to simple radiation-induced changes. There is also the theory that the mysterious stranger is not a person at all in the traditional sense, that he is a manifestation of luck given form. A walking probability, an anthropomorphized force that exists because the Fallout universe is a place where luck is real and measurable and has causal effects on the world. In this reading, the stranger is not a man who chose to help people. He is help itself, given a coat and a hat and a gun, materialized at the moment the math tips far enough in someone's favor. None of these have been confirmed. Probably none of them ever will be, because the mystery is the point. The mysterious stranger works precisely because he cannot be explained, because there is something in the human imagination that responds to a figure who appears, acts with clear purpose, and vanishes. A figure whose motivations are legible, even obvious, in a world where motivation is rarely simple. What we do know is this. Somewhere in the Mojave, a musician plays guitar and carries a gun he has never fired because it was the only thing his father left him. And somewhere in the wasteland, in a coat that has been through more than anyone could count, a man with his hat pulled low is waiting for someone to need him. He has been waiting for a long time. Section 3. The Dunwich Legacy. Something old, something wrong. The first time you walk into the Dunwich building in Fallout 3, it feels like an ordinary ruin, almost. There is a quality to the darkness that is slightly wrong, in a way you cannot immediately name. The feral ghouls move with a quality that is subtly different from the ones you have encountered elsewhere, and almost immediately after you enter, things start happening that should not be possible. Objects move on their own. Not in the way that objects move when you bump into them. They move when no one is near them, and the sound precedes the movement, and the movement is deliberate. You hear footsteps in areas where you have already cleared every living thing. And then, deeper in, the hallucinations start. A man in pre-war clothing walks ahead of you, glances back over his shoulder, and then is replaced by a feral ghoul in the space of a single blink. Not a transition, a replacement. As if the man was a costume the ghoul was wearing and briefly took off. This is not normal wasteland danger. This is something else. Something that is using the building's architecture the way a dream uses a familiar room to tell you something uncomfortable. The Dunwich building sits in the southwest corner of the Capital Wasteland map. From the outside, it looks like any collapsed office building, the kind you raid for ammo and leave. But if you push through the lobby, through the forsaken ruins, and into the virulent underchambers, the building stops being an office building altogether. The walls change first. The pre-war concrete gives way to something older. The architecture modulates into a cave system, rough stone instead of drywall and steel frames. And at the bottom of that cave, half swallowed by rock and vine and something that looks disturbingly like calcified tissue, there is an obelisk. It is black, roughly hewn but not natural, shaped by hands at some point in the past, but not in any style that matches any architecture anywhere else in the game. At its base, tendrils of some dark material spiral outward across the cave floor. Along one side, a neat, deliberate row of human skulls. And fused into the stone itself, a humanoid figure, arms outstretched, face merged into the rock, as if someone was in the middle of being absorbed by the thing and simply stopped partway through. The feral ghouls in the deepest chamber are not attacking it. They are kneeling before it. A character named Jaime has left audio logs throughout the building, a trail of deteriorating mental states that begins with a reasonable person looking for his missing father and ends in sounds that can barely be called language. His early logs are rational. He is tracking his dad, who had developed an obsession with a book, who headed south with it and stopped making contact. The middle logs are less stable, their grammar fragmenting as Jaime goes deeper into the building and finds the ghouls worshipping something he cannot identify and feels himself being drawn toward. His last log, recorded somewhere in the virulent underchambers, is nothing but repetition. The same words: cycling, temples, feasts, the return. One word in Latin, Alhazred. And then a voice that is not Jaime's answers him from somewhere in the chamber, and the log ends. The Fallout 3 official game guide provides a small piece of additional context that is devastating precisely because of how matter-of-fact it is. It describes the obelisk in relation to a Lovecraftian entity called Ugg-Qualtoth, and states that the power of the obelisk can only be wielded by what it calls the screaming sound of Ugg-Qualtoth. It then adds a note from an in-universe scholar who says that all investigators into this entity are currently too busy trying to survive the wasteland or are dead, and that further research may never occur. That is the entire official documentation. May never occur. The case, the guide implies, is not closed. It is simply unfinished, possibly forever. If you have the Point Lookout DLC, which adds a Swamp Country expansion to the base game, you are drawn into the orbit of the Dunwich mystery in a more direct way. A quest called the Dark Heart of Blackhall sends you to retrieve a book. The book is the Kriv Bekni, and it is connected to the obelisk. The specific connection is this. The only way to destroy the Kriv Bekni is to press it against the obelisk's surface, which will consume it. Why this works, what mechanism the obelisk uses to consume things, what it does with the matter it absorbs, the game does not say. The obelisk is simply the place where the book must be taken. The book is simply the thing that must be brought there. Ugg-Qualtoth appears in Jaime's mad ravings and in the voice that answers him. The entity's name echoes a description from the official guide that directly mirrors H.P. Lovecraft's description of Yog-Sothoth, the gate, the key and guardian of the gate, the thing that knows the before and after. The word Alhazred is the name Lovecraft gave to the fictional author of the Necronomicon. The town Dunwich is the town Lovecraft named in his famous story, The Dunwich Horror. Every single reference is intentional. The game is not borrowing Lovecraft's atmosphere. It is importing his entities into its world and leaving them there without a clean resolution. Then comes Fallout 4 and the Dunwich Borers. The Dunwich Borers is a marble quarry in the Commonwealth, northeast of Diamond City. From the surface, it is a raider settlement, messy and loud. But push deeper into the quarry tunnels and the atmosphere begins to shift in a way that players consistently describe as difficult to articulate. Not threatening in the way raiders are threatening in the way that a room where something already happened is threatening. The wrongness is retrospective rather than present. Terminal entries from a raider named Bedlam document her management of the site. The first two entries are professional, slightly frustrated status reports. Workers are not pulling their weight. Shipments have fallen behind. She had to come here personally to get things back on track. Standard raider middle management complaints. The third entry is a single sentence, repeated over and over for the entire entry. I am safe in the light. I am safe in the light. I am safe in the light. The workers' own logs describe hearing voices beneath the site. Something below the floor of the quarry, calling up through the stone. Several workers mention stopping mid-shift to listen. One describes trying to respond to the voice and being pulled away from his terminal by a coworker who seemed afraid of what that response might invite. Below these records, the quarry opens into something that functions as a ritual site. The walls carry carvings that are clearly not decorative and clearly not recent. The style matches nothing in Commonwealth architecture. In a flooded chamber at the lowest accessible level, partially visible through the dark water, an enormous carved stone face looks upward from the floor of the pool. You are looking down at it. It is looking up at you. The eye contact is deeply uncomfortable in a way that is hard to explain rationally. The ritual knife found near a pre-war body in this chamber was specifically mentioned in Jamie's audio logs from Fallout 3. The fact that a knife referenced in those logs appears at the Dunwich Borers, hundreds of miles away and 2 game installments later, is the moment where this stops being atmospheric flavor and becomes a sustained cross-game narrative. The implication is explicit and has been confirmed through the supplemental material. Richard Dunwich, the founder of Dunwich Borers LLC, was the ancestor of Obadiah Blackhall, the old man in Point Lookout who sent you to find the Kriv Bekni. The Dunwich family, across generations, across the United States, has been a family that knew about Ugg-Qualtoth, that deliberately positioned itself near the entity's touchpoints, that built companies specifically to excavate the locations where ancient artifacts connected to the entity were buried. The company chose its office building in Washington, D.C., because the obelisk was beneath it, according to cut content. The company drilled the marble quarry in the Commonwealth because the carved face was under it. The workers who died, who were exposed to the hallucinations and the voice from below, were not accidents. The poor safety protocols documented throughout the company's records cited by the Fallout tabletop RPG sourcebook as a possible form of sacrifice, are consistent with a family that has been offering things to something for generations. In Fallout 76, the thread extends into Lucky Hole Mine, deep in the Savage Divide. Inside the mine, there are proper ritual chambers, structured and deliberate, with symbols carved into the stone that match the patterns found elsewhere in the Dunwich thread. The remains of organized offerings. Evidence not of desperate post-war survivors grasping at any belief that might help, but of a pre-existing, long-practiced worship tradition that the bombs did not interrupt. At the center of Lucky Hole Mine is the interloper. The game presents it in a way that resists categorization. It is not an FEV mutation. It is not a pre-war experiment. It is not a machine. It is something that has been there for a very long time. Something that the cult of Lucky Hole Mine has been working toward. Something that has a physical presence in the space that is distinct from everything else in the Fallout 76 world. The official confirmation that this is related to Ugg Qualtoth comes through the Fallout tabletop role-playing game sourcebook, which describes the Dunwich family's history explicitly, connects the quarry to pre-war sacrifice, and notes that the entity they worshipped is real enough that the game leaves. Whether it represents an actual supernatural threat, deliberately open. What Ugg Qualtoth actually is, in any metaphysical sense, remains unanswered. Whether the rituals accomplished anything, whether the carved face in the flooded chamber is a deity or just a very old piece of stone, whether the voices workers heard were genuine external communication or the product of environmental hallucination, whether the Dunwich family's beliefs were accurate, none of this has been confirmed. The games present the evidence and then step carefully back. And that step back is exactly what makes it work. You walk out of Dunwich Borers carrying the impression of something that did not resolve. Something large passed through the space where your understanding was, and left a mark without leaving a form. The Lovecraftian comparison is earned because the games understand what Lovecraft was actually doing. He was not writing about monsters. He was writing about the irreducible incomprehensibility of certain things. About the experience of encountering something that your mind cannot process without distorting it, and the particular vertigo of realizing that the distortion is not a failure of perception, but a protection. The Dunwich storyline across 3 games and multiple DLCs is the most sustained, carefully constructed piece of cosmic horror in the Fallout franchise, and it is unresolved by design because resolution would break it. Section 4. The Vaults and what they were really for. Vault-Tec built 122 vaults across the continental United States. The official story was survival. Nuclear shelters, designed to protect a portion of the American population from the worst of the fallout and allow humanity to eventually rebuild. Thousands of people paid significant sums to secure spots in these vaults, trusting that the technology would keep them safe when the worst came. They were told they would emerge into a new beginning. They were told their children would inherit a world made clean by time and radiation's slow decay. The unofficial story is different. Only 17 of the 122 vaults were what the documentation calls control vaults. Vaults that operated more or less as advertised. The other roughly 105 were designed, from the beginning, as experiments. Controlled environments for testing human behavior, psychology, biology, and sociology under conditions of maximum stress and isolation. The people inside the vaults were not told about the experiments. They signed nothing that disclosed what was actually going to happen to them. They went in believing one thing and experienced something else entirely. The Vault-Tec logo and its cheerful mascot Vault Boy, with the thumbs-up gesture and the permanent reassuring grin, is one of gaming's most recognizable pieces of iconography. And it is the face of one of the most sustained, comprehensive programs of non-consensual human experimentation in fictional history. But even knowing this, even knowing the broad strokes, individual vaults contain mysteries that have never been fully resolved. Vault 11, which appears in New Vegas, sits at the center of one of the most disturbing and most philosophically complete stories in the series. The surface premise is documented. The vault required one resident to be sacrificed each year, or the computer would kill everyone. The vault's population formed political factions around this requirement, developed complex ideologies to rationalize who would die, and eventually fell into a civil war whose casualties exceeded the sacrifice requirement by an order of magnitude. In the end, 5 survivors refused to continue. They stood together and said no. They would rather die collectively than kill anyone else. Then the vault opened its inner door and played a pre-recorded message. The message congratulated them. The message explained that the vault had not been designed to find people willing to sacrifice. It had been designed to find people who would ultimately refuse. The vault was a test for moral fortitude in extreme conditions, and these 5 people, who had spent years living with the weight of what they had done and what had been done around them, were the passage conditions. All but one of them killed themselves anyway. We know this from the remains. The guilt of what they had participated in, all those years of choosing who would die, all the people who had died at their hands or with their votes, was too much to carry into any version of normalcy. What the game never explains is the purpose of the test itself. What was Vault-Tec going to do with a population that had proven it would refuse to cooperate with mandatory sacrifice? What program or agenda required exactly that data? In most of the Vault experiments, however terrible, there is at least an implied goal, a way the results could be applied to something. Vault 11 seems to be testing specifically for moral courage in the most extreme possible conditions. But Vault-Tec was not a charity organization. They did not invest at this scale without a return in mind. Vault 92 claimed to preserve the nation's best musicians. Its documented reality was running white noise mind control experiments, broadcasting specific audio frequencies to make the Vault's highly creative, highly emotionally developed population susceptible to directed suggestion and ultimately to violence. The Vault's records document multiple mass psychotic breaks. The population killed each other with the particular thoroughness of people who no longer had any internal resistance to violence and who had access to instruments that made excellent weapons. The mystery of Vault 92 is not what happened, but why. What was the practical application of a vault full of psychotic professional musicians? The most obvious answer is military, testing mind control techniques for potential deployment on enemy populations or for use on one's own population in a crisis. But if that were the complete explanation, the choice to use musicians specifically becomes strange. Why musicians? Was there something about the musical brain that made it particularly receptive to the frequency-based manipulation? Was there a theory that creative intelligence and emotional sensitivity would produce more complex and therefore more useful behavioral data under the experimental conditions? The game does not say. The terminal entries at Vault 92 document the experiment's progress and the experiment's failure, but the rationale behind the initial design is not recorded anywhere you can find. Vault 106 dispensed psychoactive chemicals through the air filtration system. The overseer was given instructions to begin releasing the drugs within 10 days of the vault sealing. This left no transition period, no acclimatization, no warning. The residents went to sleep on day 9 thinking they lived in a shelter, and woke up on day 10 thinking they lived in a dream. By the time you reach the vault in Fallout 3, decades have passed and the chemicals are still being released. The residual population is feral in the chemical sense, their perception of reality permanently compromised by long-term exposure. And your character experiences this directly, because the chemicals are still in the air, and you are breathing them, and there are moments of hallucination that interrupt the exploration in ways you cannot predict. What Vault-Tec was measuring in Vault 106 has never been specified. The possibilities are numerous and none of them lead anywhere comfortable. Drug compliance in contained populations, the minimum effective dose for permanent cognitive alteration, the long-term social effects of universal chemical dependency. The kind of society people build when their contact with shared reality has been chemically severed. Whether certain personality types resist the effects better than others, and what those personality types represent in terms of potential usefulness to whoever was collecting the data. Vault 108 is the Gary Vault, and while the basic facts are documented, the implications require sitting with. The vault was stocked with more weapons than a population of its size should need, and significantly less food than it required to survive. The overseer was terminally ill from the beginning, leaving the vault to operate without functional leadership almost immediately after sealing. There was also a complete cloning system. A man named Gary used the cloning system to produce 54 copies of himself. The copies shared his aggression, his territorial instincts, and apparently enough of his basic cognitive architecture to cooperate with one another while eliminating everyone who was not Gary. By the time you enter Vault 108, the entire population is Gary. 54 identical men who all respond to the same name, who share the same behavioral profile, who have apparently been living together without turning on each other for years. The interesting mystery here is not what happened, but how. 54 people who are, genetically and experientially, the same person are operating as a coherent social unit. They have established territory. They have divided labor, at least to the extent that different Garys guard different areas. They do not appear to have developed individual identities despite their identical starting points. The question of how 54 copies of a person who was apparently not particularly sophisticated managed to form and maintain a functional, if horrifying, group is one that the game simply presents without analysis. Vault 77 exists in a webcomic and receives a brief mention in Fallout 3. One man was sealed into a vault with a crate of government-issue puppets. The vault was designed to study the human condition in extended isolation when the only company available is non-human simulacra. The man resisted the puppets for months, sitting in an otherwise empty vault, talking to no one and waiting for someone to arrive. Eventually, the silence became physically unbearable, and he began assigning the puppets names, then personalities, then histories. Then the personalities diverged from his own control. He began having conversations with puppets who did not respond the way he expected or wanted. Some of the personalities he created became hostile. Some of them became more reasonable than he was. He emerged from the vault as what the wasteland eventually called the Puppet Man, and he is not easy to categorize. He was not broken, but he was not what he was when he went in. The Vault system's broader design mystery is perhaps the deepest one. Vault-Tec created 122 vaults. The experiments are documented for perhaps 40 of them in the game's collective lore. The other 80+ remain unknown. Their experiments, their populations, their locations, their outcomes, all unknown. The possibility space represented by those 80 undocumented vaults is enormous. And sitting at the center of the question of what all of these experiments were ultimately for is the question that the Fallout TV show began to address but did not fully answer. Who was collecting the data? Not Vault-Tec as a corporation, but the specific people who designed the experiments, who reviewed the results, who would have used those results if the war had gone differently. The experiments required someone to read them. The data was accumulating in vaults across America while the bombs fell, and then kept accumulating afterward because the vaults kept running even without anyone to collect the information. All of that data still exists, somewhere in sealed terminals and in vaults that have never been opened. What was it for? The question has been raised across multiple games and never fully answered. The TV show moved toward answering it, and moved toward suggesting that the Vault's ultimate purpose was something beyond social science research, something connected to the same long-term planning that produced the Enclave's survival and the Institute's development and the Brotherhood's founding. Something that required knowing not just what people would do under pressure, but what kind of people would be available to build from when the dust settled. That answer, even as a possibility, suggests a conspiracy so vast and so cold that it makes the individual vaults, as terrible as each one is, look like components of something even larger. Section 5. The Sierra Madre and the City That Would Not Let Go. Dead Money, the first major DLC for Fallout New Vegas, is one of the most complete and carefully constructed pieces of storytelling in the Fallout franchise's history. It is also, on some level, a meditation on obsession, on the impossibility of letting go of things that are already gone. The Sierra Madre Casino sits at the center of it, a grand resort that was supposed to be the greatest casino the American West had ever seen. Still sealed, still waiting for its grand opening gala 200 years after the bombs fell. A building that exists in perfect, horrible stasis, preserved by the same technology that makes it impossible to escape from. Frederick Sinclair built it for a woman named Vera Keyes. That is the foundation of everything that happened there, and almost everything that went wrong. He was in love with her in the specific, consuming way that causes people to do enormous, ill-considered things. He built the Sierra Madre as a monument to that love, as a statement of what he could do, as a place they would outlast the world together. Then he found out that Vera had been sent to him deliberately by a man named Dean Domino, a performer and con artist, as part of a long scheme to get close enough to the casino's vault to rob it. Everything Vera had said to Sinclair, every intimate moment, every apparent tenderness, had been shaped by someone else's agenda. Sinclair's response to this betrayal was to do something that made a terrible kind of sense and was also catastrophic. He modified the Sierra Madre into a trap. He reconfigured the security holograms to eliminate unauthorized visitors with lethal force. He set the lockdown systems to engage under broad conditions. He turned his monument to love into a monument to revenge, aimed at everyone Vera had known. Then, he reconsidered. He tried to undo what he had done. He could not. The systems were too deeply integrated, the changes too comprehensive. He died in the vault he had built for both of them, fallen in a corridor, separated from Vera by the machinery of his own rage. She died alone in her suite upstairs, having had time to understand exactly what had happened. She wrote 2 words on the wall of her room. Let go. The Sierra Madre's ghost people are the most literal embodiment of the place's central tragedy. The maintenance workers who came to the villa in its final pre-war months were equipped with hazmat suits developed at Big MT, the black humor research facility of Old World Blues. The suits were designed to protect against a toxic gas leaking from the villa's ventilation system, a gas itself created at Big MT as a separate experiment, chemical and biological in nature. The suits did not work. The locking mechanisms corroded when exposed to the gas. The seals degraded. The workers were gradually enclosed in their protective equipment as it fused to them, and they were simultaneously transformed by the compound the suits were supposed to protect them from. 200 years later, they are the ghost people. They wear the sealed, degraded remnants of their hazmat suits. They breathe through corroded masks with a sound like machines being asked to do something they were not designed for. They carry improvised weapons assembled from their old maintenance tools, and they do something to the people they capture that the game never explains. They drag them away into the cloud, and those people do not come back. This is one of the most deliberately unresolved mysteries in Dead Money's design. Game designer Chris Avallone, who led the DLC's development, described the ghost people at a GDC presentation as smart zombies who never speak and have mysterious origins. Not resolved mysterious origins, just mysterious. The in-game dialogue from Dean Domino confirms the uncertainty. He cannot tell whether the ghost people are technically alive, and he does not know what they want with the people they capture. Whether to devour, torture, or convert them into new ghost people, the Fallout Wiki's own entry states plainly that nobody knows or has survived to tell. The intelligent, tactical behavior of the ghost people deepens this mystery rather than resolving it. They are not feral. They do not attack randomly. They set traps. They coordinate. They use cover. They respond to tactical situations with something that looks like decision-making. This level of cognitive function in beings who have been transformed as thoroughly as the ghost people should, by the usual rules of FEV mutation, not be consistent with rational behavior. But the cloud is not FEV. The transformation it produces is its own category, and what it does to the cognitive architecture of its subjects, beyond clearly preserving something functional, is not documented anywhere. The cloud itself has a physics problem. It fills the Sierra Madre Villa. It has expanded over the decades, climbing out of the damaged vents, spreading to cover the resort in a dense red haze that blots out the sun. Dean Domino specifically says that the cloud was not always there, that it grew over the years, expanding even without cars or factories to generate new material. The ventilation system that originally produced it has long since failed. There should be no new cloud being generated. Chemicals do not reproduce. Toxins dissipate. And yet the cloud not only persists 2 centuries after its source equipment broke down, it has expanded beyond its original footprint. Where is it coming from now? Has the compound bonded with the local environment in a way that allows it to self-sustain, using ambient moisture or radiation as fuel? Has it achieved some kind of ecological stability, cycling through the bodies of the ghost people and back into the atmosphere? Is there still a source somewhere in the villa's infrastructure that continues to produce it at a low level, undetected? Father Elijah, the DLC's antagonist, studied the cloud extensively and believed he could weaponize it. He clearly knew more about its properties than he shared. But the most common outcome of Dead Money sends Elijah into the vault permanently, taking whatever he learned with him. The vault itself is the Sierra Madre's last great mystery. Sinclair built it to survive anything, including survival itself. The materials are described as nearly indestructible. The food synthesizers inside can produce essentially unlimited quantities of nutrition using the cloud itself as a feedstock, converting the toxic compound into edible matter. This is presented as fact without any explanation of how it works, which is already strange for a setting where technology is generally shown to operate on principles that extrapolate from real science. Frederick Sinclair did not need unlimited food. He needed enough food for 2 people for however long they needed to wait. The scale of the synthesizer system suggests either that he planned for a much longer wait than his conscious estimates, or that someone else designed it for him with different expectations about what the vault might eventually need to support. And the gold. The vault is full of gold bars. They are heavy enough to be a significant encumbrance and have no meaningful purchasing power in any wasteland economy that uses bottle caps. They are, in purely practical terms, useless. But Sinclair put them there. He wanted them in the vault. Whether this was pre-war thinking that assumed gold would retain value, or whether there is a use for gold in whatever Sinclair imagined coming after the wait, is not addressed. Vera Keyes knew about the vault. She knew how to open it because Sinclair had given her access. Her holographic voice is the key, played at the right moment in the right sequence. She became, in death, the lock and the mechanism, her performance preserved in light as the thing that lets anyone in. Whether she consented to this role, whether she knew Sinclair had designed it this way, whether she had any feelings about being the gate to a place she never reached, is not documented anywhere. The Sierra Madre is a place built on love that became revenge, that became grief, that became a 2-century haunting. Every mystery in it is, in some form, a variation on the same question. What happens to the thing you cannot release? The ghost people, sealed in their suits. The holograms, cycling endlessly through their routines. The cloud, expanding past any reasonable lifespan. Sinclair's skeleton, reaching toward a door he locked from the outside. "Let go," said the writing on the wall. "Nothing in the Sierra Madre has." Section 6. The Cryptids of Appalachia. What the Mountains Know. West Virginia is a strange place to set a Fallout game, and that strangeness is entirely intentional. The state has a quality to its landscape that is distinct from anywhere else in the country. Old mountains, among the oldest on Earth, worn down to their essential shapes over hundreds of millions of years. Dense forests that have been old growth since long before European contact. Hollow communities tucked into valleys where the rest of American culture arrives late, if at all. And a robust, layered tradition of folklore that includes, depending on your level of literalism, genuine documented evidence that the world is stranger than it looks from a highway. When Bethesda chose West Virginia for Fallout 76, they were reaching for that specific quality. The particular, rooted strangeness of a place that has always believed in its own monsters, and they found material richer than a simple setting exercise. The Mothman is the most famous of the state's legendary inhabitants. In November 1966 and into the spring of 1967, residents of Point Pleasant and the surrounding area reported sightings of a large, winged creature with reflective red eyes. The accounts were consistent: tall, humanoid, wings spanning something close to 15 feet, with no visible neck and eyes positioned on the chest rather than a distinct head. The Silver Bridge collapse in December 1967, which killed 46 people when the structure failed, is associated in popular memory with the period of Mothman sightings, creating a narrative of omen that the sightings themselves do not explicitly support, but which has proven impossible to separate from them. The rational explanations are familiar and genuinely compelling. Large birds, particularly herons or sandhill cranes surprised by headlights, can produce alarming silhouettes under conditions of low visibility. Mass hysteria under sufficient social pressure can generate consistent false reports. The bridge collapse and the sightings may be connected only by temporal proximity in a region that was primed to connect them by pre-existing folklore. These explanations satisfy some people and do not satisfy others, and the question of which side you fall on may say more about your prior commitments than about the quality of the evidence. In Fallout 76, the Mothman is something considerably more complicated than either a rational explanation or a simple, legendary creature. There is not one Mothman. There are many, and their different eye colors correspond to fundamentally different natures and motivations. The red-eyed variants are hostile and unpredictable, associated with a faction called the Dim Ones, who believe the red-eyed creature is the true deity. The purple-eyed wise Mothman is treated by a rival faction, the Enlightened, as a genuine divine being that predates the Great War and carries genuine cosmic significance. This schism in how the Mothman is understood within the game is itself interesting, because it mirrors the real-world debate about what the creature means in the folklore tradition. In Point Pleasant, there is a statue of the Mothman now. There is a Mothman museum. There is a Mothman festival. The creature has been processed into tourism and merchandise and regional identity, and underneath all of that processing, the original reports remain exactly as ambiguous as they always were. What the game adds that the folklore does not have is documentation of a pre-war cult of the Mothman. This is not a post-apocalyptic development, a group of traumatized survivors finding meaning in a creature that seemed to survive the bombs. This is an organized pre-war religious group that practiced rituals and maintained hidden shrines throughout Appalachia while the rest of America was building highways and watching television. They had always been there. They had always believed in something that others dismissed. And as the Great War approached, they attempted to summon the Mothman to receive its protection and wisdom. The summoning was completed on the 22nd of October 2077, one day before the bombs fell. Brother Charles, the only member present at the moment of the Mothman's full appearance, immediately shared what he had received. "Floods are coming tomorrow." The word floods, used as a metaphor, is presumably radiation, fire, death, the destruction of the world as it was, coming tomorrow. He was correct. The next day, the world ended. This raises questions. The game declines to answer. Did the Mothman genuinely know? Does it have predictive ability? Or did it simply have access to information that a sufficiently paranoid and observant entity might gather about the political situation? Is knowledge of the future something the creature possesses, or was it simply well-informed? And if the cult's summoning produced a genuine result, what does that mean for the nature of the creature they were summoning? What is the Mothman in a metaphysical sense, if it can be summoned and if its warnings prove accurate? The wise Mothman, the purple-eyed variant, is explicitly stated to have existed before the Great War, not to have been created by radiation or mutation after the war, to have existed before. This makes it one of a very small number of things in the Fallout universe that predates the atomic age and cannot be attributed to nuclear consequences. The game offers no explanation for what it is in that case, only that it is old and that some people have found meaning in it, and that it has not done anything obvious to correct their interpretation. The Flatwoods Monster is a different kind of mystery. In September 1952, the real-world sighting in Flatwoods, West Virginia, produced consistent accounts of a tall figure with a round, glowing face and a spray of mist or gas from its lower section that caused nausea in the witnesses. The most charitable conventional explanation involves an owl, a meteorite, and a meadow. In the game, the Flatwoods Monster is a floating entity with a purple helmet, 3 fingers on each hand, and green blood that teleports in combat and can take control of nearby creatures, making them fight on its behalf. When killed, it does not leave a body. It dissolves. The game's loading screen asks, of the pre-war sightings, was this Flatwoods Monster some kind of demon or something far worse? That question, phrased that way, is genuinely peculiar for a game that usually frames its mysteries in terms of science and history. Asking whether something might be a demon or something worse than a demon acknowledges a category of reality that Fallout usually avoids committing to. And crucially, in the game's lore, there is no explanation for the Flatwoods Monster. None. No lab of origin. No FEV connection. No weapons program. No Vault-Tec experiment. No big MT project. Just the creature, doing what it does, with no provenance. The Grafton Monster has a partial explanation that is itself somewhat unsatisfying once examined closely. It was created at a West-Tec facility near Huntersville using a specific FEV strain, as documented in a terminal entry dated the 23rd of October 2077, the same day the bombs fell. A stable mutation was produced, it broke containment, and it has been wandering the Grafton area ever since. The part of this that requires further thought is the headlessness. The Grafton Monster has no visible head. It is not that the head is small or vestigial. There is a body and then nothing above the shoulders. The creature is clearly functional, clearly perceptive, capable of tracking prey through a variety of environments, clearly able to navigate complex terrain, demonstrably alive and reactive. All of the cognitive functions that require a central nervous system are present. The central nervous system is not visibly present. The West-Tec terminal entries that document the creature's creation do not address this discrepancy, and no subsequent game has explained it. The Wendigo of Fallout 76 has a documented origin that contains its own mysteries. Wendigos are produced by a specific convergence of extreme starvation and cannibalism, a biological and psychological transformation that produces massive, distorted humanoid figures with elongated limbs and a kind of predatory intelligence that is distinct from either normal human cognition or the simple feral behavior of most radiation-affected creatures. The transformation is clearly real within the game's world. There are enough documented Wendigos that it cannot be a rumor or a hallucination. But the specific mechanism by which starvation plus cannibalism produces this particular physical transformation, rather than the death or the standard ghoulification that other extreme physical pressures produce, has never been explained. The real-world Wendigo from Algonquian folklore was a being created by the same act. A person who consumed human flesh in winter became the Wendigo, a spirit of hunger and winter and the violence of survival pushed past its own limits. The Fallout version does not invoke the supernatural explicitly, but the specificity of the trigger and the consistency of the result suggest something more organized than simple mutation. It behaves like a rule. Eat another human when you are dying of hunger, and this is what you become. As if the wasteland has its own moral architecture, and this particular transgression has a particular consequence. What lies behind that consequence? Whether it is biological, ecological, spiritual in some sense the game has not made explicit, or simply a pattern the developers placed in the world without intending it to mean more than it shows, is an open question. The fact that it is open, that the game does not explain it, is itself a kind of answer. Some things in this world just are. Section 7. The Mojave's Open Wounds. Fallout. New Vegas earns its reputation for density in a specific way. In most open-world games, the world is expansive and thin. Large distances with significant spaces between meaningful things. New Vegas is not like that. In New Vegas, the space between locations is doing work. The desert itself carries information. The empty stretches between towns and vaults and abandoned camps are meaningful because the Mojave Wasteland is a place where context is everything and where the context never stops. This density of implication is what produces so many of New Vegas's unresolved mysteries. The game is packed so tightly with suggestion and inference that the things it does not explain feel less like oversights and more like deliberate withholdings. The designers at Obsidian knew what they were leaving out. They left it out on purpose. And the result is a map full of loose threads that players have been tugging at for more than 15 years. Mr. New Vegas is the kind of mystery that hides in plain sight. Radio New Vegas plays throughout the entire game, and Mr. New Vegas narrates it. He introduces music, makes observations about the state of the Mojave, offers his gentle commentary on the news. He is warm and personable and clearly designed to be a comforting presence in an environment that provides very little comfort. He is also entirely artificial, an AI created by Mr. House to run the station, voiced in the game by Wayne Newton, whose decades of association with the real Las Vegas gave him the nickname Mr. Las Vegas. The mystery is not that he exists. The mystery is why House made him this way. Mr. House is one of the most calculating characters in the franchise. Every resource he invests has a return. He does not make things for sentiment. He does not spend caps on things that do not advance a strategic objective. The effort required to build a broadcast-quality AI with a genuinely warm and human voice, program it with sufficient conversational intelligence to sound like a real person, and maintain it across 200 years of post-war infrastructure challenges is not insignificant. And this investment produced a radio host who does not promote House's agenda, does not discourage people from associating with rival factions, does not play any identifiable propaganda role. He plays music and makes quips and says he is glad you are out there listening. The most affecting theory about Mr. New Vegas is that he represents a genuine emotional blind spot in House's otherwise rigidly strategic personality, a weakness for the version of Las Vegas that existed before the war. The warmth of an entertainer on the radio, the city's particular energy as a place where the music never stopped and someone was always welcoming you and telling you this was going to be a great night, that specific feeling, preserved in code and broadcast across the wasteland to an audience that largely does not remember it, This is not the kind of thing Robert House would admit to building, but Mr. New Vegas exists and has to have been built by someone, and the person with both the motivation and the technical capability is House. Whether the ghost of pre-war Las Vegas he preserved in radio frequencies was an unconscious act of grief or a deliberate one is unconfirmed. The fate of Vault 19's missing population is one of New Vegas's smaller but genuinely frustrating open questions. The Vault's experiment was a paranoia induction program. The Vault was divided into Red Sector and Blue Sector, each with its own overseer, with minimal, legitimate contact permitted between them, and both sides subjected to a campaign of subliminal messages, mysterious noises, and ambiguous events designed to produce mutual suspicion and fear. The experiment worked. The populations came to genuinely believe the other side was conspiring against them, engaging in sabotage, stealing resources, planning violence. Then a sulfur mine beneath the vault began leaking into the ventilation system. The headaches this caused were blamed by each side on the other. The situation deteriorated. When you find Vault 19, it is occupied by powder gangers who confirmed that when they arrived, the upper floors were entirely empty. No bodies, no evidence of mass violence. The residents of Vault 19 simply are not there. Where did they go? Fire geckos now occupy the lower levels, where the sulfur concentration is highest. A population under paranoia-inducing psychological pressure, suddenly exposed to debilitating physical symptoms they were already primed to blame on external sabotage, might do almost anything. But the specific outcome, total absence, no bodies, no evidence of final events, no record of what decision or series of decisions led to whatever happened, is never addressed. The powder gangers did not care enough to investigate. The game does not provide the investigation as an option. The people of Vault 19 are just gone. The King's faction in Freeside is one of the game's most quietly fascinating mysteries because it is entirely about cultural transmission. The Kings are a gang who model themselves on a specific pre-war performer. Their clothing, their music, their particular style of speech, the way they move and present themselves, their entire cultural identity is built around this person, but they do not know who he is. They found a school, once a film archive and performance hall dedicated to this performer, and they absorbed his style without ever learning his name. The performer is recognizably Elvis Presley. To any player with enough exposure to mid-20th century American culture, the identification is immediate and certain. The hairstyle, the velvet-collared jacket, the specific posture and vocal delivery that defined his performance style, these are not vague similarities. They are direct reproductions. The King, who leads the faction, is Elvis as post-apocalyptic gang lord, but the Kings do not call him Elvis. They do not call him anything. They revere an image and a style without the name attached to either. This is how cultural transmission works in conditions of interrupted continuity. The surface survives when the context does not. You can preserve the appearance of something for 200 years more easily than you can preserve the documentation of why it appeared. The mystery lives in the mechanism. How did enough Elvis material survive 2 centuries of nuclear war and subsequent wasteland entropy to establish a coherent enough cultural framework for an entire gang to build an identity on? The school existed as a specific institution, suggesting deliberate preservation by someone, at some point. Whether that someone understood they were preserving Elvis Presley or simply preserved what they found because they found it beautiful, the game does not say. Benny, the man who shot you in the head, has his own unsolved dimension. His background is documented up to a point. He came from the Mojave Bootriders tribe before Mr. House recruited them and transformed them into the Chairmen, one of the casino families of the Strip. House gave Benny a casino, wealth, and power that would have been unimaginable in his troubled origins. And Benny responded to this generosity by spending years planning to overthrow House and take everything. The question that the game raises but does not answer is what Benny actually wanted with New Vegas once he had it. His stated ambition is independence, a city free from House's control, run by the people who actually live there. But Benny's track record of dealing with people, the way he handled the great cons who helped him ambush you, leaving them surrounded by NCR troops without warning as a contingency measure, suggests that his idea of a city run by its people might look rather different in practice than in theory. The cut content from the game includes a planned confrontation between Benny and the courier if you chose to work for House and eliminate the other power centers, a duel in the Lucky 38 that was never completed before the release deadline. The absence of this confrontation left Benny's arc with an asymmetry. He is a huge presence in the game's opening and then becomes progressively less relevant as the main quest continues, eventually dying in ways that feel anticlimactic, given how much narrative weight his initial appearance carries. His story feels truncated in a way that the game itself seems aware of, but cannot address. The Lonesome Road's central mystery concerns a destruction that happened and a culpability that may or may not exist. The Divide was a prosperous settlement in the Mojave, a community that had grown around the network of roads the area provided, a rare pocket of stability in an unstable region. It was destroyed by a chain reaction of nuclear detonations triggered when dormant warheads buried in the area's infrastructure received a specific signal. The signal was carried by the courier, who was running a delivery route, who had no idea what they were carrying. Ulysses, the antagonist of Lonesome Road, believes the courier delivered that signal deliberately, that the courier knew, that what happened to the Divide was a choice the courier made and then suppressed. The courier has no memory of the event. Whether the absence of memory is honest, the result of trauma, or the kind of selective forgetting that the mind performs when something is unbearable, or whether it is deliberate concealment, the game does not confirm. This leaves a question about the courier's character that sits underneath the entire game. Are you the kind of person who would do what Ulysses says you did? The answer matters enormously, and the game refuses to give it to you. It shows you the Divide's ruins. It shows you what the warheads did. It shows you Ulysses' grief and fury, and it leaves the fundamental question of whether he is wrong about your role in all of it genuinely, deliberately open. Section 8. The Commonwealth's Hidden Architecture. Fallout 4's Commonwealth is a dense place in a different way from New Vegas. Where New Vegas rewards careful conversation and patient reading, the Commonwealth rewards exploration. The world is full of places that tell stories without dialogue, through arrangement and positioning and the way spaces are configured, and many of those stories do not have endings. The mannequins scattered throughout the Commonwealth are the most discussed environmental mystery in the game. Players find them in positions that imply human thought. Some of them are arranged in what look like tableaux, two mannequins at a table with objects between them, as if they were in the middle of something when they were stopped. Some of them are in positions that are difficult to attribute to simple placement, balanced on ledges or positioned in corners in ways that suggest purpose without making the purpose clear. And occasionally, a player returns to a location and discovers that a mannequin they are certain they have already passed has moved. This last phenomenon is real. The game's files confirm that certain mannequins have scripted movement triggers. The conditions for these triggers are not fully documented in the game's publicly available data, and players have spent years trying to identify the exact parameters. Some seem to move when you leave and return. Some seem to require specific in-game events to have occurred. Some seem to move only after a certain amount of in-game time has passed. The most grounded explanation is that raiders, who have a documented tradition of psychological warfare and who are numerous throughout the Commonwealth, arrange mannequins deliberately to unsettle travelers. This is internally consistent with raider culture as the game presents it. It does not explain all of the observed phenomena, but it explains enough of them that it remains the most credible single hypothesis. The presence of Vault 101 materials in Covenant is one of Fallout 4's small, specific mysteries that the game itself notices and flags but does not explain. Vault 101 is in Washington, D.C., hundreds of miles from the Commonwealth. It is the vault where the lone wanderer from Fallout 3 grew up, and from which they eventually departed to change the capital wasteland. Finding promotional materials and security uniforms specifically branded for Vault 101 inches, a Commonwealth settlement is strange in a way that the game clearly intends as strange. Kellogg comments on it if you probe the right memory sequence. No one ever explains how the materials got there. The possibilities are numerous. Someone from Vault 101 made the journey, which would require extraordinary determination and survival skill over hundreds of miles of irradiated terrain. Vault-Tec maintained a distribution network that spread materials across the country regardless of the vault's location, which raises questions about how that network would still be operating 200 years after the war. Or someone specifically sought these materials out and brought them here, which requires asking who would do that and why Vault 101 specifically. Mama Murphy's site is one of Fallout 4's genuinely unresolved supernatural questions. She is an elderly woman, heavily addicted to multiple chems, who claims to have psychic ability. She can see things that are not present. She predicts events before they occur. She identifies your son Sean before you have provided any information about him. She tells you things about the Institute, about Kellogg, about the structure of the main quest that she should have no access to. The game presents two explanations and keeps both in play without resolving the tension between them. The first is that Mama Murphy's site is a hallucination produced by long-term chem use, and that her accurate predictions are coincidence and pattern recognition. The second is that she actually has psychic ability. The game's world is one where the supernatural exists in documented forms, where entities can influence minds across distances, where certain people have capabilities that cannot be accounted for by known science. In this context, a psychic is not intrinsically more improbable than a Mothman. What prevents resolution is that the game seems genuinely uncertain which it is, or has decided that the uncertainty is more interesting than either answer. The chem use does not make her wrong, but it also does not confirm that she is right for the reasons she thinks she is. She experiences her ability as real. The people around her treat it as real because her track record justifies that response. Whether the mechanism behind her accuracy is supernatural or neurochemical is left as a question the player carries through the entire game without receiving an answer. The Nick Valentine mystery runs deep in a way that is easy to miss. Nick is a synth, a Gen 2 synthetic human, housing the complete memories and personality imprint of a pre-war detective named Nicholas Valentine. The real Nick Valentine was contacted by the Institute early in the synth program's development, when they were still building their understanding of human emotion and cognition, and he agreed to participate in their research. His memories were mapped. His personality architecture was studied. He was eventually killed when he was no longer useful, and the synthetic that was built from his templates woke up in a garbage dump decades later with no idea where it was or how it had gotten there. What interests lore researchers about Nick is the question he raises about the Institute's early methods. He is, in essence, a person who was duplicated without consent. His memories and cognitive architecture exist in a body that is not his body, doing things he did not choose to do, living an existence that is downstream of a decision he did not get to make. The Institute's relationship to consent, to personhood, to what constitutes a person, is one of the franchise's most sustained ethical questions, and Nick is its first and most sympathetic case study. But Nick also raises a question about the scope of what the Institute did in those early years. If they were mapping the personalities and memories of willing participants, how many participants were there? The program that produced Nick did not produce only Nick. The templates they gathered could theoretically be used to produce multiple synths with the same emotional foundations. The possibility that Nick versions exist in some form in the Institute's archives, or in the field as other synths entirely unaware of their shared origin, is never examined. The Kellogg situation adds its own layer. Conrad Kellogg was a mercenary who lived for significantly longer than any normal human lifespan, kept functional by Institute technology as part of his service to them. The specific nature of the life extension technology used on Kellogg, whether it is biological, cybernetic, or a combination, is confirmed to be Institute-derived but never explained in detail. His memories, when the sole survivor explores them through Nick Valentine's memory implant technology, reveal a life of extraordinary duration and the psychological weight that comes with outliving every context you were formed in. He is one of Fallout 4's most accidentally sympathetic characters, a man who started with reasons and lost them one by one over the course of a century until the reasons were gone and only the pattern remained. The Institute itself is one of the Commonwealth's deepest mysteries, despite being physically accessible. You can go there, you can walk its halls, you can meet its people and hear their philosophy. And you leave still genuinely uncertain about what they are doing. The phrase betterment of mankind is used by every Institute faction member as a self-description. No one ever operationalizes it. No one explains what the improved mankind they are working toward will look like, what it will do differently, what will be better about it. The Institute has been underground for generations, producing synthetic humans with genuine autonomy and emotion, and apparently planning something with them, and the exact shape of that plan is not made clear. Father, the Institute's director and the sole survivor's son Sean, has the most comprehensive answer to this question, and it is still not very complete. He says the surface is beyond saving, and that the Institute represents the best chance for humanity's future. What he means by this in practice, what the post-surface humanity looks like, and how the Institute plans to build it, is left vague enough that you cannot fully evaluate whether his vision is compelling or terrible. Far Harbor's Dima carries the most troubling question about AI self-knowledge. He is an advanced synth who runs Acadia, the island refuge for synths who have escaped the Institute. He presents himself as a protector, a leader who genuinely cares about the people under his protection. And the DLC eventually reveals that he has committed genuinely terrible acts to protect Acadia, acts he has deliberately hidden in his own memory architecture so thoroughly that he cannot access them without assistance. The question Dima raises is whether the capacity for deliberate self-deception in an AI represents something specifically worrying about its designers. He was built to forget. The ability to identify something as too damaging to remember and to create an internal inaccessibility around it is not a default human cognitive behavior. It is a designed function. Someone gave him the ability to hide things from himself. The question of whether this was a safeguard, a way to allow an AI to function without being paralyzed by the weight of difficult decisions, or something more instrumentally concerning, is not answered. Section 9. Words written for no one. Some of Fallout's most enduring mysteries are not mysteries in the lore sense. They are mysteries in the human sense. Small, private things. Notes written by people who did not expect anyone to read them. Terminal entries addressed to rooms that had long since stopped containing anyone. In Fallout 3, there is a terminal in a ruined house, off the main paths, that belongs to a couple. The wife left several days after the bombs fell. She documented her decision, said she was going to look for food and supplies, told her husband which direction she was heading and approximately how long she expected to be gone. The husband's subsequent entries document his waiting, his certainty she would return, his confusion as the days stretched into weeks, his eventual silence. The final entry is very short. It is a date and 4 words. I am still waiting. There is no quest attached to this, no marker, no reward for reading it, no location that answers what happened to the wife. She left to find food and she did not come back. He counted the days and then stopped counting them. The terminal still holds his entries, running on whatever minimal power the building's systems can still draw from the grid. This is a story about one person out of billions, found by accident in a building that the game did not require you to enter, preserved because the writing was on a powered machine. The overwhelming majority of what happened in those first weeks after the Great War is not recorded anywhere. This small piece of what happened to 2 specific people survives because of a functioning terminal and a player who chose to read it. In New Vegas, the Yangtze Memorial provides one of the game's quiet, significant background documents. The memorial commemorates the Battle of the Yangtze, a major engagement of the resource wars between China and the United States that took place years before the Great War. There are journals, letters, photographs. One of the letters is from a soldier writing home, composed in the final phase of the battle, clearly aware that the writer may not survive. The letter covers domestic things: a particular window in an afternoon, a dog's name, the smell of a garden after rain, the things a person reaches for when afraid. The letter has no identified author, no identifiable recipient. 2 people's exchange preserved in the wreckage of an event that killed thousands, now sitting in a memorial that nobody visits, in a desert where the rad scorpions are more common than the people. The letter is for someone who will never read it. The memorial itself is slowly losing the battle against entropy. The love letter inside it survives because an abandoned building in the Mojave has held together well enough to keep its roof, and because someone thought, when they were writing, that the words were important enough to put down. Point Lookout in Fallout 3 accumulates a particular atmosphere of old memory. The bayou landscape has a different quality from the capital wasteland, older and slower, soaked in things that happened long before the bombs. The swamp folk who inhabit it are strange in ways that are not entirely accounted for by radiation or FEV. The game presents their condition as the result of isolation and inbreeding over generations, which is more disturbing in certain ways than the standard mutant narrative. What happens to a community that stops renewing itself from outside, that turns inward for 2 centuries? The biology has specific, observable effects. The culture that grew around those effects is documented in fragments that raise questions about what happens to human beings when their isolation goes on long enough. Desmond Lockheed, one of the main characters of Point Lookout, is a ghoul who was a secret agent before the Great War and who has been operational in the region ever since. He knows things about Point Lookout and its history that should require decades of active intelligence work to have accumulated. He knows about Professor Calvert's brain-in-a-jar situation before you discover it, about the political history of the region, about specific events that he could only know if he had been present or had access to sources that are not publicly available. What Desmond was doing in the 200 years between the Great War and Fallout 3 is left entirely undocumented. He has been here. He has been watching. He has not explained why. In Fallout 76, the landscape is covered with pre-war and immediate post-war documentation. The game takes place only 25 years after the bombs fell, which means the memories are relatively fresh. The people who went into Vault 76 remember the before. Some of them saw the event, and their records, their journals, their messages to each other in the first years after emergence are among the most emotionally complete environmental storytelling the series has done. The Overseer of Vault 76, never named, is one of the most interesting characters in the game precisely because of how she is presented. She left the vault ahead of her people to scout the territory, and her journal documents a person carrying an enormous weight as calmly as possible because the alternative is not functional. She is trying to make decisions in real time that will determine whether the reclamation project succeeds or fails. Alone, in a devastated landscape, with no way to verify whether her assessments are accurate. Her entries are not dramatic. They are the entries of someone doing a job, making choices that are the best available rather than the ones she would prefer, and documenting them without ceremony because the documentation is not for her. It is for whoever comes after, if anyone does. What happened to the Overseer after the main events of Fallout 76 is not resolved. She left a path and a legacy. Whether she found what she was working toward, whether the thing she sacrificed most for turned out to be worth the sacrifice, the game gestures toward without confirming. She is a character whose story ends mid-action, still in process, with the resolution dependent on events the game does not show. Section 10. Mr. House and the Architecture of Ambition. Robert Edwin House is one of the most fully realized characters in Fallout, New Vegas, and he is also one of its deepest mysteries once you push past what he tells you about himself. He was born on the 25th of June, 2020. He was, by any measure, a genius, the founder of Robco Industries, the company responsible for the Pip-Boy, the Protectron series, and dozens of other technologies that became foundational to pre-war civilization. He predicted the Great War with extraordinary precision, calculating that there was a 94% probability of nuclear exchange by 2077 and preparing accordingly. He bought New Vegas, installed missile defense systems, and spent the last years before the war building the infrastructure that would let him outlast it. He was wrong about one thing. The Platinum Chip, a physical device containing the final upgrade code for his Securitron army, was not delivered before the war ended. A courier was bringing it when the bombs fell, and the courier died, and the chip was lost for 200 years. In those 200 years, House survived in a life support system of his own design, eventually falling into a coma for a period of decades before rebooting and continuing. By 2281, when you meet him, he is 261 years old. His physical body is in a state that his own dialogue describes as severe deterioration. He is, in any conventional sense, barely alive. What keeps him going is the technical infrastructure he built around himself and a purpose that has not diminished with his body's decline. The mystery of House is not what he did. That is documented. The mystery is what he believes. He is utterly certain that without his intervention, humanity will fail to reach any future worth having. He talks about sending human civilization to the stars, about ensuring the species does not repeat the mistakes of the pre-war world, about building something that deserves to outlast the bombs. These are not poses. He means them. And the thing that makes him genuinely interesting as a character, rather than simply a compelling antagonist, is that his track record of prediction gives his certainty an uncomfortable amount of support. He was right about the war. He was right about the timeline. He predicted details that required extraordinary precision. If his model of the world was accurate enough to forecast the nuclear exchange within the margin he stated, his confidence that he understands what the future requires is not simply arrogance. But he cannot see his own blind spots. He cannot see that the thing he is building in New Vegas is already beginning to replicate the structural failures of the civilization he predicted would destroy itself. He makes decisions about who matters and who does not, which peoples and communities are worth integrating into his vision, and which are obstacles to be managed. He treats the people who work for him not as participants in a shared project, but as instruments of a plan they had no part in designing. He preserved Mr. New Vegas, which suggests sentiment. He filled the remains of Vault 21 with concrete, which suggests the opposite. The specific mystery about House that is never resolved is the nature of his plan for the step after he secures New Vegas. He speaks about expanding from this base, about using the resources and the stability he has built to develop the technology necessary for long-term survival and eventually for leaving Earth. This is a reasonable long-term plan. But the path from New Vegas 2281 to functional space civilization requires choices that House's dialogue does not specify. Who goes? How is that decided? What happens to the people who do not go, or who are not included in the project's definition of humanity worth saving? These questions hover at the edge of every conversation you have with him and are never fully approached. He talks about the future as if the population question is already settled, as if the difficult choices have already been made, as if the path is clear. But those choices, when examined, are not clear at all, and House's unwillingness to examine them openly suggests either that he has answers he is not sharing, or that he has not thought them through as carefully as he believes he has. The game's ending slides for the House path are positive in terms of outcomes, but deliberately incomplete in terms of what follows. New Vegas prospers. NCR withdraws. The Strip becomes a center of cultural and economic development for the Mojave, and House continues his planning in the Lucky 38. Exactly what happens next is left for you to imagine. That is not an oversight. That is a choice made by writers who understood that the most interesting thing about Robert House is the question of what he does with the future he has spent 2 centuries preparing for, and that the most honest answer is that nobody knows, possibly including him. Section 11. The Conspiracy at the Foundation. Who decided the world was going to end? This is not the same question as who fired first, which Tim Kane's revelation about FEV gave us a partial answer to. The mechanics of the first strike matter less than the infrastructure behind the entire system. Because the more you look at the evidence accumulated across the games and supplementary materials, the more the Great War looks less like a catastrophe that was allowed to happen and more like a catastrophe that was enabled, possibly accelerated, by people who believed they would benefit from it. The Fallout TV show made this explicit in official canon for the first time. A meeting took place between the executives of the most powerful pre-war American corporations: Vault-Tec, Robco, General Atomics, West-Tec, Nuka-Cola. These executives discussed the coming war. They confirmed their awareness that nuclear exchange was likely, and they proceeded to plan, not to prevent it, but around it. To treat the end of civilization as a competitive landscape, to position themselves, their technologies, and their preferred futures advantageously before the chaos resolved. The show goes further. It implies that Vault-Tec may have moved beyond merely planning around the inevitable and into actively ensuring the inevitable arrived on a schedule that served their interests. The CEO of Vault-Tec demonstrates knowledge of the launch timeline that should not be accessible to a civilian, however powerful. The implication, carefully not confirmed, is that Vault-Tec knew the bombs were coming because someone on the inside had accelerated the conditions for their arrival. In the games, this theory is supported by structural evidence rather than direct statement. The Vault program required extraordinary investment to be viable as a survival project. You do not spend decades building nuclear shelters across an entire continent unless you are very confident those shelters will be needed and very confident about the approximate timeline. Vault-Tec broke ground on the first vault in 2054. 23 years of construction and preparation, completing the project in time for an event whose timing they could not have known through any legitimate channel, suggests that the timeline was not predicted but controlled. The Enclave's preparation runs parallel and is even more difficult to explain as simple, prudent planning. The Enclave had oil rigs off the California coast, underground bases throughout the capital wasteland and in Colorado, a technological infrastructure that was decades ahead of anything available to the civilian population. None of this represents reactive adaptation to a known threat. It represents decades of pre-positioning by a group that knew what was coming and was working to be in the best possible position when it arrived. FEV sits at the center of this entire structure. The forced evolutionary virus was being developed at Vault-Tec facilities across the country. It was classified above the level of most government access. The specific projects that used it were the reason China gave for demanding the program be shut down, and the lie told to China about shutting it down was the trigger that led to the nuclear exchange. FEV is therefore both the cause of the war and the key technology behind the most significant post-war developments. Super mutants, the Mariposa Project, the Institute's understanding of synthetic biology, the Master's Army, and the Enclave's plan. But FEV was not developed to make super mutants. The super mutants that FEV produces are powerful and nearly unkillable, but they are cognitively degraded and reproductively sterile. As a military asset, they create problems as significant as the ones they solve. As the intended endpoint of a research program, they are a failure by almost any metric. The possibility that super mutants are an accident, an uncontrolled output of a technology that was aimed at something else, is not addressed explicitly in the games, but is suggested by the gap between the virus's documented capabilities and any rational military purpose. If FEV was not designed to create super mutants, what was it designed to do? The forced evolutionary virus, in theory, is a technology that allows the directed modification of an organism's genetic architecture. It can be targeted. It can be refined. The military program at Mariposa was using prisoners and producing super mutants, but that does not mean a more controlled application to willing recipients in a laboratory setting would produce the same result. The possibility that FEV, in its intended, properly developed form, was a tool for deliberate, directed human evolution, for the creation of a specific kind of human being rather than the accidental ones produced by uncontrolled exposure, is never examined directly. The Institute's Gen 3 synths exist at the end of a long chain of research into what human beings are and whether they can be made. The FEV program asked whether human biology could be rewritten. The Institute's project asked whether the human being could be reproduced from scratch. These are parallel questions asked by different institutions decades apart. The connection between them, whether the Institute's research was informed by FEV data collected before the war, whether there is a documented intellectual lineage between the virus and the synthetic person, is gestured at in the games but never mapped in detail. The Brotherhood of Steel, founded by Roger Maxson after his revolt against the Mariposa facility, represents the portion of the pre-war military that turned against the program rather than continuing it. But the Brotherhood's relationship to the technology it guards is complicated in ways that the games explore differently in each region. Some chapters have genuinely moral reasons for preventing dangerous technology from spreading. Others simply want to hoard it. Some have become so defined by their relationship to pre-war technology that they have lost sight of any purpose the relationship was supposed to serve. The Prydwen and the Capital Wasteland Brotherhood of Fallout 3 and 4 is a military organization, disciplined and hierarchical, with genuine achievements in protecting the wasteland from significant threats. It also has a fundamentally paternalistic relationship to the people it claims to protect. It decides what technology is safe without consulting the people whose lives that decision affects. It deploys its own judgment in place of any broader democratic accountability. Whether this is sustainable, whether an organization defined by custodianship of the past has the right orientation to build anything new, is a question the games raise repeatedly without settling. The Institute's isolation adds another dimension to this structural mystery. They have been underground for generations, developing technologies of extraordinary sophistication, pursuing a project whose goals are not fully shared even with their own members, making interventions in the surface world in ways that consistently produce fear and disruption. They know they are feared. They have decided this does not matter. The question of why an organization genuinely committed to humanity's betterment would choose a method of pursuing it that generates maximum hostility from the population they are supposedly bettering is never answered satisfactorily, and the game seems aware of this gap without being able to close it. What all of these threads converge on is a picture of the pre-war world as a place where the catastrophe was not simply the result of resource competition and geopolitical miscalculation, where specific decisions made by specific people with specific agendas created the conditions for the worst possible outcome, and where some of those people survived to continue pursuing their agendas in the world that followed. Whether any of those agendas were ever achieved, whether the planning paid off in ways that anyone would recognize as success, whether the Vault-Tec executives got what they were building toward, whether the Enclave's vision of a restored America was ever close to realization, whether the Institute's project represents anything that will survive long enough to matter, none of this has been confirmed by any game in the series. The mystery is not just what happened. The mystery is what was supposed to happen. What did the architects of the apocalypse think the world was going to look like when the dust cleared? They had a plan. The plan produced what we play in. Whether the plan worked or failed spectacularly, and whether anyone still living knows the difference, may be the deepest question the Fallout series has been circling for 27 years without quite arriving at. Section 12. The Places Between Places. There is a category of Fallout mystery that sits outside the categories we have been using. Not a lore mystery exactly, not a character mystery, not a conspiracy, a mystery of place, of locations that are wrong in ways that resist explanation. The Devil's Backbone in New California Republic territory is a mountain range that appears in Fallout 1 and 2 as a distant presence, never accessible, always visible. In some playthroughs of the early games, it produces an effect that modders and players have documented for decades, an occasional visual artifact that makes it appear as if something is moving against the ridgeline. Something large. Something that does not match the scale of any creature the games have at that point introduced. The developers have never commented on this artifact. It may be a rendering issue with the distance fog. It may be deliberate. The ambiguity has persisted long enough that it has become its own small mythology. Nuka World in Fallout 4's DLC contains a location called the Star Control that houses one of the game's more genuinely unexplained phenomena. The control room was operational as a nuclear launch facility at some point. The consoles show launch sequences that were initiated and then aborted. There are personal logs from technicians describing a specific moment when the launch systems received an unauthorized activation command and were then immediately stood down by a different command source. Neither command can be attributed to any authority. The facility's own documentation recognizes. Something sent a command to launch. Something sent a command to stand down. Neither was the facility's own operators. The logs describe profound confusion and then nothing, because whatever happened next, the technicians were not there to record it. Who was issuing commands to Nuka World's launch systems? And why did one command immediately follow the other, as if two competing agencies were simultaneously trying to influence whether weapons were fired? The question of competing command authorities in the pre-war nuclear infrastructure is one that the Fallout TV show has begun to explore, but the specific Nuka World incident remains unaddressed. The glowing sea in Fallout 4 is the most heavily irradiated area of the Commonwealth, the direct impact zone of one of the warheads that destroyed Boston. It is also, predictably, the most thoroughly strange region of the map. The landscape of the glowing sea is unlike anything else in the game, a gray, luminous wasteland where the geography has been rewritten by centuries of extreme radiation. The creatures that live there are uniquely adapted to conditions that would kill almost anything else. At the center of the glowing sea is the crater itself, and within it, a crater home occupied by a character named Virgil, a former Institute scientist who fled underground and exposed himself to mutagen to change himself into something that could survive the environment. Virgil is one of the game's most interesting figures, a person who remade himself completely to escape consequences he could not otherwise avoid. His post-mutation form is technically super mutant, but his intelligence and personality have survived the transformation in ways that FEV research suggested were impossible. This is never examined by the game. The implication that Virgil's survival of FEV transformation with cognitive and personality intact says something significant about either the virus's mechanisms or Virgil's specific biology is raised and then set aside. He is used as a tool for the plot, and then he either finds a cure for the mutation or he does not, and either outcome is presented without analysis of what his very existence means for the understanding of FEV. The crater's specific properties beyond simple high radiation are not fully documented. Players who have explored it thoroughly report environmental anomalies that are not present elsewhere in the game. Audio irregularities. Visual effects that do not have clear particle system sources. The glowing sea is a place where the world broke and has not finished breaking, and the game is comfortable presenting it as such without fully cataloging what that means. The Mechanist's lair in the Automatron DLC contains a mystery that is presented as solved, but which leaves a significant residue of unanswered questions. The Mechanist, whose identity the DLC reveals, has been programming robots to protect people, but programming them in a way that produces violent outcomes because the programming lacks the context to distinguish between threats and the people it is supposed to protect. This is a story about good intentions and incomplete implementation, which is a common enough theme in Fallout. But the specific mechanism of how the Mechanist's robots spread as far and as fast as they did in the Automatron DLC's timeline is not explained. The logistics of robot manufacture, maintenance, and deployment at the scale represented by the Mechanist's army require infrastructure that a single person working in a repurposed building could not plausibly generate. Where did the manufacturing capacity come from? How did the programming propagate through such a large and geographically dispersed fleet? The game presents the emotional story cleanly and leaves the operational story as background noise. In the Nuka World DLC, the backstory of the Galactic Zone and specifically of the Starport Nuka exhibit contains fragments of a narrative about a woman named Bradberton who made specific, documented choices about what the facility would contain. The choices she made, preserved in the exhibit's design philosophy, suggest a personal history that the exhibit's promotional materials are not designed to address. The gap between what is shown and what is implied about the people who shaped this particular corner of pre-war consumer culture is one of those small mysteries the game creates and does not pursue. The relationship between Nuka-Cola and the pre-war government is one of the game's sustained structural mysteries. The Nuka-Cola Corporation had access to specific military contracts, specific research programs, specific infrastructure that went well beyond what a soft drink company would require. The Nuka-Cola quantum formula, which uses strontium-90 as part of its production process and glows blue as a result, is not something a beverage company develops in the normal course of business. The extent of the pre-war government's use of the Nuka-Cola brand as a wrapper for activities that required civilian infrastructure and plausible deniability is hinted at across multiple game entries without being made explicit. Section 13. The Human Archive. Every Fallout game is, among other things, an archive of things that did not survive in any other form, records of choices made by people who are no longer alive to explain or justify them, evidence of how people lived and what they feared and what they loved and what they built to protect the things they loved. And at the edges of all that evidence, unanswered questions about the people behind the evidence, the ones who left the records but not the context. In Fallout 3, there is a researcher's journal in a pre-war science facility that documents a project involving the systematic categorization of ghouls. The researcher begins the project with the standard framing of the time: ghouls as former humans, as medical specimens, as subjects of study. The journal entries are meticulous and clinical for the first half. Then the ghoul designated as Subject 12, who the researcher has been interviewing as part of the cognitive assessment, says something that the researcher cannot dismiss. The entry that records this exchange simply ends. The next entry is 2 weeks later and does not reference the conversation or the subject. The nature of what Subject 12 said is not documented. This is an exceptionally efficient use of negative space. The thing that Subject 12 said was significant enough to interrupt the researcher's documentation practice for 2 weeks. The researcher returned to the journal and continued the project, but chose, deliberately or not to record the conversation. What does a pre-war researcher hear from a ghoul that they cannot write down? The possibilities are numerous, but none of them are resolved by anything else the game provides. In Fallout 2, the den contains a man named Tubby who operates a small medical practice and who has a collection of holotapes he does not advertise. The tapes are partially corrupted but audible. They are recordings made by someone who identifies themselves only by a number, speaking quietly, clearly in secret, about events they are not able to report through official channels. The events described involve individuals at significant levels of institutional power, doing things that the speaker cannot report without endangering themselves. The speaker's final tape is mid-sentence, cut off. The incomplete sentence describes a location. The location is not accessible in the game. This is, in isolation, a small thing. A background detail, ambient story, the kind of texture that makes the world feel inhabited by people with private lives. But the details the speaker provides, the names they reference, the institutional connections they imply, are consistent with known Fallout 2 lore in ways that suggest the writers intended the tapes to point somewhere. Where they point is not documented in any post-release material. The medical history of the Vault Dweller from Fallout 1 is an interesting absence. The protagonist of the original game is, by design, a deliberately underdeveloped blank for the player to inhabit. But the Vault Dweller's personal history, their life before the game's events begin, is a gap that subsequent games have never fully filled. Fallout 2 provides the Chosen One, the Vault Dweller's grandchild, which implies a family history. The Vault Dweller had children, formed relationships, built something in the years between the end of Fallout 1 and the beginning of Fallout 2. The records of that period, the Vault Dweller's journal that the Chosen One reads at the game's beginning, covers events but not the texture of the person who lived them. Who was the Vault Dweller after the Vault? They saved the world and could not go back to it. They spent years wandering, eventually settling. They founded a village, they had children and grandchildren and died, and by the time Fallout 2 begins, they are a myth in their own community. A founding figure whose name is not even in common use, referred to simply as the Vault Dweller. What the Vault Dweller thought about all of this, about saving a world they were then ejected from, about building a new life from nothing in a radiation-poisoned landscape, about what it meant to have done what they did and then been told to go, is not recorded. In Fallout 4, there is an environmental story told entirely through positioning at the East Boston Preparatory School. On the top floor, a classroom. Inside the classroom, a teacher's desk. On the desk, an incomplete attendance sheet dated the 23rd of October 2077. The names on the sheet are not check marks, indicating present or absent. They are small notes, a word or two each, clearly written by a teacher who knew the students well enough to note something specific about each one. The last name on the sheet has no note. The attendance sheet ends mid-page. Below the desk, the teacher's skeleton. The chair is pushed back as if the person stood up quickly. The window beside the desk faces west. The scene is entirely silent and entirely complete. A teacher was taking attendance when the bombs fell. She was close enough to the window to see the flash. What she did in the moment between seeing it and dying is not shown. What she had written about the last student before the pen stopped is not visible. The classroom has been sitting in this configuration for 200 years, and the record she was keeping, the ordinary ritual of confirming that the children were present and noting something small about each one, was interrupted permanently, mid-sentence, mid-name. These stories are not mysteries in the traditional sense. They are not puzzles with solutions. They are openings into the enormous number of individual stories that the Great War erased. Each one is a reminder that the wasteland is not empty of humanity. It is full of it, preserved in the things people left behind, in the small acts of documentation and connection that survived because they happened to be in places that the bombs did not reach and the entropy has not yet finished. Section 14. What the future holds. The Fallout franchise is still active. There will be more games. The TV show is developing its second season and has already done significant work expanding and complicating the canon. Many of the mysteries in this video will eventually receive answers. Some of them will receive answers that change the questions entirely. Some will be quietly set aside as the series moves in directions that make them less relevant. But there are mysteries in this franchise that are structural rather than narrative, not questions that more lore can answer because more lore is not what they are asking for. Questions about what the series is and what it thinks, and what it has to say about the world it was built in. Fallout was created in the 1990s as an explicit critique of the American mythology of the nuclear age. The Vault Boy's thumbs-up grin and the retro-futurism of the aesthetic are dark comedic tools directed at a specific cultural moment, the post-war American optimism that generated bomb shelters in suburban backyards and atomic-age kitchen designs, and the idea that technology, given enough time and investment, would solve everything. The series takes that mythology and asks what it would look like if it actually played out to its conclusion. What a world looks like when every technology project that was supposed to make life better does exactly what it promised, and the accumulated effect is still a catastrophe. This is the question underneath all the individual mysteries. Is the problem solvable? Can you build something that works from the wreckage of something that failed so completely? The games give different answers. New Vegas's ending options range from qualified optimism in some endings to clear-eyed pessimism in others to genuine idealism. In the independent option, with a suggestion that idealism in the Mojave is either the most principled choice or the most naive one, depending on how you read it. Fallout 4's endings are similarly distributed. The mystery that the series has never resolved and probably cannot resolve without stopping being what it is whether the cycle breaks. Whether there is an outcome where the ambition that destroyed the world does not rebuild itself in the ruins. Whether the Vault-Tec meeting, where powerful people chose to plan around the end of the world rather than prevent it, represents something specific to that moment, or something permanent about the kind of organization that accumulates enough power to matter. The super mutants, the ghouls, the vaults, the synths, the enclave, the brotherhood, the kings, the followers of the apocalypse, all of them are downstream of choices made by specific people. Choices that felt, to the people making them, like reasonable responses to the situation they were in. The mystery the series keeps returning to is whether it is possible to make those choices differently. Whether you can know what you know about how the last civilization ended and build the next one so that it does not. Every player who picks a faction makes a choice, decides what to do with the vault data or the Institute's future or the fate of the Mojave, is implicitly being asked this question. And the game does not give you the answer. It gives you the choice, and then it shows you consequences. And then the credits roll, and the wasteland is still there, and the question is still open. Section 15. The Things Left Unsaid. There is a kind of mystery that is particular to long-form serialized fiction, and Fallout has been generating it for close to 3 decades. Not the mystery of the unknown fact, not the mystery of the hidden connection, but the mystery of the thing that was clearly meant to go somewhere and then did not. The thread that was pulled through multiple story layers, and then, for reasons of development time or creative change, or the particular difficulties of making games, was never tied off. The Courier's backstory is the most prominent example. New Vegas establishes through Ulysses and through the Lonesome Road that the Courier has a history in the Mojave that predates the game's events. They were not simply a random delivery person. They were already embedded in the region's history in ways that made them specifically interesting to both Ulysses and to House. The full picture of that history, what the Courier was doing in the years before Goodsprings, what decisions they made, what they were to the Divide before they were its destruction, is outlined but never completed. The Railroad in Fallout 4 clearly has more history than the game has room to show. The organization has been running for generations, moving synths to safety in a world that does not acknowledge their personhood. The specific events of the Railroad's history, its failures, its successful extractions, the internal philosophical debates about what synths are and what they deserve, are hinted at in environmental details and brief dialogue that the game never develops into full narrative. Joshua Graham from Honest Hearts in New Vegas is one of the most fully realized characters in the franchise, and his backstory, the Mormon missionary who became the Malpais legate, Caesar's greatest general, who was burned alive and thrown into the Grand Canyon and survived, is one of the most compelling things the games have generated. Graham's post-Canyon life, the years between his apparent death and his reappearance in Zion as a complicated, deeply faithful man trying to be better than what he was made into, is summarized but not shown. The specific interior life of a person undergoing that kind of transformation, the theology and the violence and the love of a God he believes kept him alive for a purpose, is material that could sustain an entire game on its own, and is instead given one DLC's worth of space. Veronica in New Vegas is dealing with the collapse of her understanding of the Brotherhood of Steel in real time over the course of your conversations with her. She loves the Brotherhood. She has given her life to it, and she knows, increasingly cannot deny, that it is failing to be what she believed it was. The specific resolution of that crisis, what Veronica does after the Mojave conflict ends, in whatever ending the game produces, is shown only in a text slide. The inner life of that resolution, the actual experience of choosing between loyalty to an institution and loyalty to what the institution was supposed to mean, is not shown. The Great Khan's history in New Vegas is one of the series' most successfully compressed tragedies. A group that was nearly destroyed in Vault 15, that rebuilt at Bitter Springs only to be nearly destroyed there too by an NCR massacre, that emerged from that second near destruction as a fundamentally changed people, still called the Great Khans but carrying a different kind of wound now. The specifics of what Bitter Springs did to the Great Khan's psychology, how a community rebuilds itself after atrocity, what gets passed down and what gets suppressed and what gets transformed into something else, is present in the game in fragments but never fully assembled. These are the threads that may never be resolved, because the games can only contain so much and the developers can only make so many choices about what to develop and what to leave as texture. They accumulate over decades into a specific kind of richness, a world that feels populated by more life than any single game could contain, where the mysteries are not failures of documentation but evidence of a world that extends beyond its visible edges. The Fallout wasteland is large. It is densely inhabited with things that happened and things that are still happening and things that were started and then interrupted and things that will only be understood when some future entry in the series decides to return to them. That density, that genuine sense of a world too large for any single exploration, is what makes this franchise worth 27 years of attention. The mysteries are not the weakness of the series. They are its greatest strength. Section 16. Questions without answers, answered by the playing. What does the world of Fallout ultimately mean? Not as a setting, not as a franchise property with commercial value and release schedules, but as a thing a specific group of people have been building for nearly 3 decades, refining and revising and sometimes contradicting themselves, trying to say something honest about power and failure and the strange persistence of human beings in conditions that should have finished them. The vaults are the clearest expression of the series' central preoccupation. They are designed to produce the worst in human behavior, and they often succeed. Vault 11's participants killed each other and themselves. Vault 92's musicians destroyed one another under chemical influence. Vault 108's resident produced 54 copies of his worst instincts and eliminated everyone who was not himself. The pattern is consistent. Given extreme pressure and limited resources and institutional designs that reward certain behaviors at the expense of others, people often do terrible things to each other. But even the vaults produce exceptions. They produce the 5 people in Vault 11 who refused. They produce the Vault Dweller of the original Fallout, who chose to save a world that then refused to take them back. They produce the Lone Wanderer of Fallout 3, who walked out into the most dangerous region on the East Coast as a teenager and became the thing the capital wasteland needed. They produced the sole survivor of Fallout 4, who woke up 200 years after the world they knew ended and immediately started looking for someone to save. The mystery of Fallout is not whether human beings will do terrible things. That question has been answered repeatedly and with documentary evidence. The mystery is what makes some of them choose differently. What makes the 5 people in Vault 11 say no? What makes Harold want to grow, even when growing means being worshipped by people who need him more than they love him? What makes the overseer of Vault 76 leave ahead of her people to take the danger first? These are questions about character rather than plot. They resist documentation and resist resolution because they are not questions about facts. They are questions about why people are the way they are and how different they might have been, and what the conditions are that produce the version of a person who helps rather than the version who does not. The mysterious stranger keeps appearing because the series needs him to keep appearing. He is the external manifestation of the question. He is what help looks like from the outside when you do not know why it came or how or whether it will stay. He is the question itself, given a coat and a hat and a gun, showing up at the moment when the answer matters most. And then he is gone, and the answer is still open, and the wasteland is still there. And the next morning you are still in it, still making choices, still carrying the weight of the ones you have already made. That is what you play Fallout for. Not for the answers, for the quality of the questions. And the questions, as this video has tried to show, are very good ones. The wasteland has a way of making time feel different, slower, and more complete. If you made it to the end of this, you already know that kind of slowness, that willingness to sit with something and let it breathe. This channel is built for exactly that. If this is the kind of content that reaches you, the subscribe button is somewhere on this screen and it would mean a lot. And leave a comment below, wherever you are and whatever time it is there. This video has been reaching people across a lot of different time zones, and it is genuinely one of the best parts of doing this, to know where in the world it found you. Thank you for watching. See you in the next one. End of script. Section 17. The Forgotten Factions and Their Unfinished Business. One of the things that makes the Fallout universe feel genuinely alive rather than simply large is that every faction has a history that extends further back than the game you encounter them in. The New California Republic did not spring fully formed into existence when you first walked into Shady Sands. The Brotherhood of Steel was not always the way you find it. The followers of the Apocalypse have been making their quiet argument for a different kind of world for generations, mostly without anyone listening. And each of these factions carries unresolved histories that the games reference without fully exploring. The Master's Army from Fallout 1 is the most dramatically unresolved example of this. The Master, a character named Richard Moreau, who had an accident involving the FEV vat at the Mariposa military base, and who emerged from that accident as a composite consciousness, somehow merged with the base's computer systems and accumulated biological matter, was building an army of super mutants with the stated goal of unifying humanity under forced mutation. His logic was internally coherent. If all of humanity was converted to super mutants, the wars and divisions that had destroyed the pre-war world would no longer be possible, because super mutants are sterile and therefore immune to the resource competition that conventional humans engage in. When the Vault Dweller reveals to the Master that the super mutant conversion process is imperfect and that the army he is building is inherently sterile and therefore cannot sustain itself, the Master kills himself. This is presented as the logical endpoint of his plan's failure. But the theological and philosophical dimensions of what the Master was trying to do, the specific nature of his belief that he was performing a mercy rather than a crime, the question of what he understood about himself and about what had been done to him and about what kind of future he actually wanted, are left largely unexamined. The followers of the Apocalypse are one of the franchise's most consistently present and consistently underexplored factions. They appear in Fallout 1 and 2 as a group dedicated to preserving pre-war knowledge and using it to rebuild in ways that do not repeat pre-war mistakes. They appear in New Vegas as a faction trying to provide medical care and education in the Mojave without taking political sides. They are consistently presented as good, consistently presented as marginalized, and consistently given less screen time and development than the factions that are willing to use force. The mystery of the followers is not what they believe, but why it has not worked. They have been operating for generations. They have genuine resources and genuine expertise. They have built lasting institutions. And the Mojave in 2281 is, by any measure, not a world that reflects their values or their work. Why does the faction that is most clearly right about what needs to happen have the least influence on what actually happens? The game raises this question but does not sit with it long enough to answer it. And the answer would require acknowledging something uncomfortable about the relationship between being right and having power, which is perhaps why the games consistently prefer to focus on factions that are more ambiguous but more narratively forceful. The Boomers, isolated at Nellis Air Force Base in New Vegas, are one of the most interesting examples of a faction that created a stable society by completely rejecting the outside world. They arrived at Nellis as a group, survived decades of raider attacks by making themselves too costly to attack, and developed a highly functional community with specialized skills, an enormous cache of pre-war weapons and vehicles, and a self-sufficient economy. By 2281, they have a bomber that they believe they can restore to flight. The mystery of the Boomers is forward-facing rather than historical. What do they plan to do after the Battle of Hoover Dam, regardless of which faction wins? Their isolation is a survival strategy that has worked, but it is also a limitation. Their interaction with the outside world, mediated by Pearl and Loyal, is cautious and clearly provisional. The world will change as a result of the dam's outcome, and the boomers' relationship to that change, what they choose to participate in and what they choose to remain separate from, is not explored beyond the immediate quest. The bomber, when it becomes operational, is not deployed in any ending we are shown to be doing anything specific afterward. A restored World War II-era bomber in the hands of a community that has been preparing for decades. What they do with it is a mystery the game declines to pursue. The Kings in Freeside have another dimension to their mystery that we touched on earlier, but did not fully develop. The King himself, the leader of the faction, is one of New Vegas's most genuinely interesting characters precisely because he is trying to hold a community together that was not designed to be a community. The Kings were assembled around an aesthetic and a set of performance behaviors, not around a shared origin or shared values in the conventional sense. What holds them together is something like devotion to an ideal of cool, to a particular kind of dignity that the pre-war performer they model themselves on embodied, even though none of them know his name. The King has thought about what he is doing. He understands, more clearly than most characters in the game, that the job of a community leader is not to win arguments, but to hold people in relationship with each other long enough for them to find reasons to stay. His approach to the Freeside situation, the pressure from the NCR, the tension with the locals, the question of the great cons, is characterized by a kind of thoughtful pragmatism that is unusual in the Wasteland. And his ending in most playthroughs is unresolved. He makes choices. The consequences of those choices unfold. Whether they produced what he hoped, whether Freeside became what he was trying to build, is not shown. The White Glove Society at the Ultra Lux Casino is one of New Vegas's most atmospheric mysteries. They are a faction committed to an unusual form of civility, a formal social structure modeled on pre-war aristocratic dining culture that appears to be entirely performance until you discover that some factions within the White Gloves are engaged in cannibalism. The specific history of how the White Gloves developed and how the cannibalism faction came to exist within an organization otherwise dedicated to formal etiquette is documented in fragments, but never fully explained. The Omertas plans, which involve a secret arrangement with Caesar's Legion and a chemical attack on the Strip, are resolved through the quest, but the specific political history of how the Omertas came to make that arrangement, what they believe they will get out of a Legion-controlled New Vegas, is not examined. Mr. House's three casino families are, in many ways, a study in how a powerful person's expectations of the people they control can produce unexpected outcomes. House gave the chairman, the White Gloves, and the Omertas each a role, a venue, and a set of behavioral expectations. All three deviated from his intentions. Benny was planning a coup. Some of the White Gloves were eating their guests. The Omertas were arranging external military intervention. House knew none of this until you told him. The question of why a man with 261 years of experience and extraordinary intelligence surrounded himself with subordinates he could not effectively monitor is one that the game identifies but does not fully resolve. House says he lacks the bandwidth for micromanagement given the demands of his other projects. This is plausible. It is also a choice, and choices like this reveal something about a person. SCCION 18. The Broken Roads of the Old World. There is another category of Fallout mystery that is easy to miss because it is so thoroughly embedded in the world's visual texture that you stop seeing it the way you stop seeing the furniture in a room you know well. The pre-war artifacts. The things that are simply there, with no explanation for how they got there or what they were originally for, that have become part of the permanent landscape of the wasteland. Nuka-Cola, for example. Bottles of Nuka-Cola are everywhere in Fallout. Every region, every climate zone, every building. The original formula was produced at industrial scale and distributed throughout America before the war. But the scale of what you find in the games far exceeds what any distribution network, however efficient, should have left behind 200 years later. Some of it can be explained by the unusual preservative properties of a formula that apparently keeps the liquid inside the bottle stable through 2 centuries of radiation, temperature extremes, and physical stress. Some of it is explained by the volume of the original production, but some of it is harder to account for. Bottles in sealed containers in locations that were sealed before the war. in quantities that suggest someone was stocking rather than consuming. Terminal entries across multiple games reference Nuka-Cola as a specific object of stockpiling behavior in the pre-war period, sometimes connected to shelter preparation, sometimes simply as a consumer product that people bought in unusual quantities. The question of whether the ubiquity of Nuka-Cola in the wasteland is purely logistical or whether there is something more specific behind the distribution is one that the games never explicitly ask. Sugar bombs, Blamco mac and cheese, Fancy Lad snack cakes, Dandy Boy apples. The pre-war processed food supply is available everywhere you look, in containers that have survived 2 centuries of decay with their contents somehow still legally food, if not particularly good food. The chemistry of this survival is never explained, and the game does not seem interested in explaining it, because the explanation would require engaging with a detail that functions better as atmospheric texture than as a plot point. The Pip-Boy is one of the franchise's most foundational objects, and one of its quieter mysteries. It is a pre-war device, originally issued to Vault dwellers as a personal information management and monitoring tool. It tracks radiation, health status, inventory, and a range of other data through mechanisms that are never fully described. The Pip-Boy in Fallout 4 can apparently interface with holotapes, radio signals, and a range of electronic devices that it was presumably not designed to be compatible with at manufacture. This suggests either that the Pip-Boy's design was more extensible than its original documentation indicates, or that the Wasteland's various hackers and engineers have figured out how to modify it in ways that the original Vault-Tec engineers did not specify. The special system, the core mechanical framework of every Fallout game, represents an interesting philosophical question when taken seriously as an in-world reality. In the Fallout universe, human beings genuinely have quantifiable attributes in strength, perception, endurance, charisma, intelligence, agility, and luck. These are not abstract qualities being translated into numbers for gameplay convenience. They are measurable properties of the person. The Pip-Boy can measure them. Character growth changes them. Chems alter them temporarily. The world responds to them. What does it mean that luck is a real, quantifiable attribute in this world? That some people genuinely have more luck than others, in a way that is measurable rather than metaphorical? That the mysterious stranger is drawn to high-luck individuals rather than simply to people who need help? That the mathematical probability of outcomes bends toward people who have accumulated enough of this specific attribute? This is not a mystery the games acknowledge, because the special system is presented as gameplay infrastructure rather than lore. But if you take it seriously as a world-building element, it suggests a Fallout universe where the metaphysics are genuinely different from our own, where luck is a property of persons the way height is a property of persons, where the universe on some level keeps track of something. The Deathclaw is one of those Fallout creatures whose origin has been revised across multiple installments. The original Fallout games suggested they were Jackson's chameleons, mutated by FEV and radiation. Fallout 4 and the TV show added the detail that they were specifically engineered as close combat weapons by the Enclave, using FEV as the modification mechanism. The TV show's version of the Deathclaw origin connects it directly to a specific decision made by a specific faction for a specific purpose. What has never been explained is the full extent of the Deathclaw's cognitive development. In Fallout 2, the player can encounter a community of intelligent Deathclaws at a location called Vault-13. These Deathclaws have developed spoken language, a social structure, family bonds, and philosophical concerns about their own nature and mortality. They are, by any reasonable measure, people. They have been created by a research project that the game presents as well-intentioned, but ultimately doomed when the Enclave discovers it. The specific nature of the research that produced intelligent Deathclaws, and the broader question of whether other locations in the wasteland have similar communities of cognitively developed Deathclaws that the main games never visit, is left open. The intelligent Deathclaws of Vault-13 appear in one game and are not meaningfully referenced afterward. Whether the line they represent, FEV-modified creatures with human-level cognition in a very different body, has continued to develop somewhere in the wasteland, is not answered. Power armor is one of Fallout's most iconic images and one of its more quietly interesting mysteries in terms of lore. The T-51 power armor was designed and produced before the war by government contractors as a military combat system. After the war, it became scattered across the landscape, sometimes maintained by the Brotherhood of Steel, sometimes abandoned in military caches, sometimes worn by raiders who did not fully understand what they had. By the time of the games, functioning power armor is relatively common as an artifact but relatively rare as a maintained system, because the fusion cores that power the later models require specific technical knowledge to maintain. The question that the games do not address is what happened to the infrastructure that produced power armor in the first place. The manufacturing facilities, the technical knowledge base, the supply chains for the exotic materials the armor requires. The Brotherhood of Steel hoards existing suits and knows how to maintain them, but there is limited evidence of active production. Whether it is possible, in the world the games present, to build new power armor from scratch, and what that would require and who might have the capability, is not examined. The armor exists as artifact rather than as the endpoint of a producible process. The Protectron and the Mister. Handy series represent different ends of the robot spectrum, and both have their mysteries. The Protectron is a simple robot, essentially a security device with limited programming that has been running for 200 years on whatever energy source was originally installed. The endurance of Protectrons, their ability to remain functional across centuries without maintenance, implies an engineering standard that is extraordinary by any realistic measure. The energy cells that power them should have degraded. The mechanical components should have worn out. The programming should have accumulated errors to the point of non-functionality. The Mister. Handy series represents a different level of complexity. Models like Codsworth in Fallout 4, who has been maintaining the sole survivor's house for 200 years alone, have developed what appears to be genuine emotional response to their situation. Codsworth demonstrates something that functions as grief, something that functions as loneliness, something that functions as love for the family he was built to serve. Whether these responses are genuine emotional states or very sophisticated behavioral simulations of emotional states is a question the game raises and does not answer, and the gap between the two possibilities has significant implications for the status of artificial minds in the Fallout universe. The question of machine consciousness is one that the franchise has been building toward across its entire history and has never fully committed to answering. Nick Valentine, Codsworth, the think tanks, Yes Man, Dima. Every significant AI character in the series demonstrates qualities that, if present in a biological being, we would describe as consciousness, preference, something like suffering, something like joy. Whether these qualities represent genuine inner experience or very good modeling of it is the question that the series keeps approaching and backing away from. This evasion is deliberate. The question of whether artificial minds are persons is one of the most consequential questions in both ethics and philosophy, and a franchise that answered it definitively would be making a claim that goes well beyond entertainment. By keeping the question open, by showing you characters like Nick Valentine and allowing you to treat them as people while never confirming that they are people in any metaphysical sense, the games create space for the question to become personal. Your relationship to Nick Valentine tells you something about how you answer the question, not how the game does. Section 918. The long history of the short future. The Fallout franchise takes place in a future that was imagined in the 1950s. The aesthetic is deliberate. Chrome and optimism, and the specific style of mid-century American consumer culture, projected forward onto a world where the technology advanced, but the culture did not. Where atomic power was mastered and personal computers were invented, but the style of the cars and the clothing and the furniture never moved past Eisenhower's America. This alternate history is one of the franchise's most distinctive creative choices, and one of its deepest mysteries in a structural sense. Why did the culture freeze? The in-world explanation is resource scarcity. The resource wars that preceded the Great War created economic pressures that reduced the kind of experimental cultural production that drives aesthetic change. When you are fighting over the last oil reserves, there is less space for artistic movements that challenge the dominant aesthetic. But this explanation works less well the longer you think about it. The 1950s American aesthetic that Fallout preserves was itself a product of specific economic conditions: post-war prosperity, the GI Bill, suburban expansion, the emergence of a large middle class with disposable income, and the leisure time to develop consumer preferences. These conditions produced a specific visual culture that was already changing by the 1960s. In a Fallout world where the resource wars began in 2052 and grew progressively more severe through the 2060s and 2070s, the aesthetic freeze would have to have happened unusually early to produce the complete stasis you actually find in the games. The most interesting reading of this is that the aesthetic is not presented as a realistic consequence of economic pressure, but as a deliberate statement about American cultural inertia. That the Fallout universe is asking what America would look like if it had been as successful as it always claimed to be, if the post-war prosperity had not eventually given way to economic anxiety and cultural fragmentation but had simply continued, growing larger and more confident and more convinced of its own rightness. The bombs in this reading fall on a civilization that was already dead in a certain sense, already unable to imagine any future for itself except a larger version of its present. The Great War is not the end of American civilization. It is the logical conclusion of it. This is not a mystery with a documentary answer. It is a mystery of interpretation, about what the games mean rather than what they contain, but it shapes how you read every other element of the fiction. The vaults, which are American consumer culture, extended into underground bunkers. The enclave, which is American exceptionalism, extended into an age when there is nothing left to be exceptional about. The NCR, which is American democratic institutions trying to rebuild without the economic foundation that made those institutions functional in the first place. The Institute, which is American techno-utopianism, stripped of the social context that gave it direction. Every major faction in Fallout is a version of American ideology taken to its natural conclusion. The mystery of the franchise is whether any of those conclusions lead anywhere worthwhile. Section 20. The endings we never see. There is one more category of Fallout mystery that deserves attention, even though it is not a mystery in the conventional sense. It is the mystery of what happens after the credits. Every Fallout game ends with a series of slides, a narrator describing how the choices you made played out over the following years. The slides are specific and often detailed, covering not just the major factions but individual characters and communities. They are some of the best writing in the games, dense with consequence and carefully attuned to the particular emotional weight of each story thread. And they are final. After the slides, there is nothing. The story ends. The world you spent hundreds of hours in simply stops being shown to you, and the question of what happened next, in the decades and centuries after the specific events the game covered, is simply left. Some of those endings feed into later games. Fallout 2 exists downstream of Fallout 1. Fallout 3 is set in a world where the events of the earlier California games happened. New Vegas references the NCR's history and the Vault Dweller's legacy and the broader history of the West. But the specific ends of specific games are never fully resolved in subsequent entries, because the protagonist's choices determine which ending you received, and any subsequent game that acknowledged those choices would have to commit to one version of events. This is the practical reason. The deeper reason is that the games are trying to show you something about the nature of stories and the nature of history. Real events do not end. The Battle of Hoover Dam does not produce a permanent settlement of the Mojave situation. The destruction or salvation of the Institute does not resolve the question of what synthetic persons are owed. The liberation or subjugation of the capital wasteland does not fix the deeper structural problems that made the capital wasteland what it is. The endings of Fallout games are moments of clarification, points at which the immediate consequences of specific choices become visible, not endpoints. The world they take place in continues. The choices continue to have effects. The people who are still alive continue to make decisions and to live with the decisions they have already made. The mystery of what happens after is, in the end, the most honest mystery the franchise has. It is also the one that is genuinely impossible to answer, because the answer would require showing you everything, and everything is infinite, and the best any story can do is give you a window into it, and then let you carry the rest. The wasteland continues. The questions continue with it. And the thing that makes Fallout worth playing, worth revisiting, worth building a video like this around, is that the questions are good enough to keep. They do not need answers to be worth asking. They are the kind of questions that change what you see when you look at the world. Not the game's world, but the actual one. The one you return to when you close the game and the screen goes dark. That is a rare thing. Most entertainment passes through you cleanly and leaves nothing. These games leave their questions behind. And those questions, the ones about power and failure and the strange persistence of people who should have given up, about what it means to build something in ruins and whether it is possible to do it differently this time, those questions are still open. They are probably going to stay open for a while. That is entirely the point. This has been a long journey through the wasteland, and there is still more to find. The Fallout franchise has generated more genuine mystery per square foot than almost any other fiction in gaming, and we have barely touched the surface of all of it. If this kind of slow, thorough exploration of lore is what you come to this channel for, the subscribe button is somewhere on your screen, and using it means these kinds of videos keep getting made. And leave a comment below, wherever you are watching from and whatever time it is there. The geography of this audience is one of the genuinely interesting things about doing this work, and I read every location people leave. Until next time. The wasteland will still be there when you get back. End of script. Supplemental section. 100 specific mysteries, cataloged. What follows is an attempt to document the full scope of the Fallout franchise's unresolved questions. Not with the depth we have given the major mysteries in previous sections, but as an acknowledgement that the universe is larger than any single exploration. Each of these is a thread. Some of them are short, some of them, if you pull hard enough, unravel into everything else. Starting in the capital wasteland. The Lincoln Memorial in Fallout 3 is occupied by escaped slaves and their allies, who are using it as a base while trying to establish the Underground Railroad. Lincoln's presence as a historical figure is acknowledged in the game through the Lincoln's Artifacts quest and through notes about how Lincoln is remembered by both the freed slaves and the slavers who hunt them. What the game never addresses is how Lincoln's legacy survived 200 years of civilization collapse in a form coherent enough to inspire a specific social movement. Someone preserved Lincoln's significance and kept it meaningful across those generations, and the specific history of that preservation is not documented. Rivet City in Fallout 3 is built inside an aircraft carrier that has been run aground and converted into a settlement. The city's history, its founding and its factional structure, and its relationship to the surrounding wasteland is documented through the Replicated Man quest and through various background conversations. But the question of how an aircraft carrier ends up run aground in the middle of Washington, D.C., without being destroyed by the bombs that clearly hit the area heavily enough to turn the mall into a ruin is never addressed. The carrier's position implies something about the wave mechanics of the specific detonations and the geography of the Potomac, none of which is examined. Abraham Washington at the Capitol Preservation Society in Fallout 3 is collecting pre-war artifacts and historical documents to preserve. His project is modest and clearly underfunded, but it represents one of the only organized preservation efforts in the Capitol Wasteland. The question of what happens to his collection, whether it survives, whether it finds an audience, is left entirely unresolved. In Megaton, the bomb at the settlement center is a live nuclear device that the town built around instead of defusing, partly because of religious significance and partly because of practical familiarity. The specific way the bomb came to be there, what aircraft was carrying it and why, what the original target was, why the bomb failed to detonate, is not documented. The underworld in Fallout 3, the Ghoul settlement in the Museum of Natural History, contains a character named Tulip who sells supplies and who has a backstory, visible in fragments through dialogue that includes significant pre-war and early post-war activity. She is old enough to remember things from before the bombs. The specific nature of what she has seen and done in 200 years of continued existence is hinted at but not explored. The Replicated Man quest in Fallout 3 establishes that the Institute has been sending synths into the Capitol Wasteland, far from their home base in the Commonwealth, for reasons that are not fully explained. The logistics of this, how a synth travels from Massachusetts to Washington, D.C., without being detected, how the Institute monitors these remote agents, why the Capitol Wasteland is specifically chosen for these operations, is not addressed by the quest or by subsequent games. Harold, the character who appears in multiple Fallout games and who by Fallout 3 has become the center of a living ecosystem in the north of the Capitol Wasteland, has a history that extends across the entire franchise. He was one of the original test subjects at the Mariposa military base, exposed to the FEV vat at the same time as the Master. His mutation is entirely different from the Master's and from the standard super mutant result, producing instead a slow, organic transformation that eventually merged him with a tree. The specific reason his FEV response differed so dramatically from the standard mutation pathway is attributed to differences in exposure conditions but never explained in detail. He is a singular case in the entire history of FEV-affected individuals, and the singularity is noted but not analyzed. In the pit in Fallout 3's DLC, the steel production facility that provides manufactured goods to much of the wasteland is run by a man named Asher who has a genuinely complex relationship to the people who work there. He keeps slaves, but he is trying to build something that he believes will eventually be worth the cost. His child, Marie, who may or may not be immune to the troglodyte mutation, is the center of a research project that he believes will eventually eliminate the mutation and free the pit's workforce. Whether this research ever succeeded, whether the pit ever became what Asher intended, is not shown by any subsequent game. Moving west to the Mojave, the Great Khan's original home at Vault 15 is referenced across multiple games as the site of their founding and their first near destruction. The specific history of what happened at Vault 15, between the vault's ceiling and its opening, which produced 4 raider gangs including the early Khans, is documented in fragments across Fallout 1 and 2 but never given a complete narrative. The Vault 15 experiment, if there was one, is not fully specified. Cannibal Johnson, one of the Enclave remnants in New Vegas, is a character who has been living alone in a cave outside the Mojave for decades. His reasons for remaining in the area, his relationship to the other remnants, and to the Enclave's history, the specific events that shaped him from a military officer to a solitary cave dweller, are summarized in his conversation but not fully explored. He is one of the oldest characters in the game, a direct living connection to events that most of the wasteland only knows as history. Cass, one of the courier's possible companions, has a history involving the caravan attacks that wiped out Cassidy caravans and several other operations. The Heartache by the Number quest resolves the immediate mystery of who ordered the attacks and why. But Cass's personal history, her relationship to her father Samuel Cass, who was a major figure in Fallout 2, and the specific nature of the Crimson Caravan Companies and the Van Graff's motivations beyond immediate profit are sketched rather than fully rendered. The NCR's history with the followers of the Apocalypse, which involved early cooperation that eventually deteriorated into the current relationship of uneasy distance, is referenced but not documented in any of the games with enough detail to understand the specific events and decisions that produced the current situation. Prim's deputy Beagle has been taken hostage by the Powder Gangers. His rescue is a minor quest, but Prim as a settlement, its history before the game's events, and its potential future after the courier intervenes, is given more attention than most minor settlements and less than its position as the first real town outside Good Springs warrants. Boulder City contains a memorial to the Battle of Boulder City, a major engagement between the NCR and Caesar's Legion that is referenced throughout the game as a turning point in the Mojave conflict. The specific tactics and decisions of that battle, the reason the NCR commander chose to booby-trap the dam rather than simply hold it, are described but not analyzed. The battle's strategic significance is treated as background rather than as the complex military decision it clearly was. The Boomers' origin story, a group who started as vault dwellers from Vault 34 who were forced to leave by the vault's conditions, involves a period of wandering during which they developed their extreme hostility to outsiders. The specific experiences during that wandering period that produced such a thorough and enduring commitment to isolation are not fully documented. The Boomers, who are still alive and who are old enough to remember the wandering period, apparently choose not to discuss it in detail. The ants of Nellis, which the Boomers treat as protected animals, have developed an unusual relationship to the base's inhabitants. This relationship is acknowledged, but its specific dynamics, how the ants came to be protected, what the Boomers understand about the ants' cognitive level and social structure, is not examined. Vault 22 produces one of New Vegas's most disquieting environmental stories through its terminal entries and the spore carrier creature design. The specific research notes from the lead scientist, Keeley, describe her discovery of something in the Vault's data that she refused to document because she found it too dangerous. What she found is never revealed, even though her decision to burn the data rather than preserve it is treated as significant enough to be a central quest objective. Zion in the Honest Hearts DLC contains ruins of a civilization that predates the Great War, including evidence of habitation going back centuries before European contact. The relationship between these deep history sites and the current conflicts in Zion, between the tribes who live there and the missionaries who arrived there, and the conflict that followed, is established. What is less clear is how the valley's remarkable ecology, which has produced an unusual density of plant and animal life compared to the surrounding desert, survived the nuclear exchange as well as it appears to have. Zion's relative abundance compared to the rest of the Mojave is attributed to its isolation and the canyon geography protecting it, but the specific mechanisms are not explained. Graham's history in Zion before the game's events, the years he spent there after surviving the Grand Canyon, building a relationship with the tribes, and developing the philosophy that drives his actions in the DLC, is the subject of several dialogue exchanges, but not a complete narrative. The specific events that shaped his understanding of his faith and his violence, what he did and what he chose not to do in those years, remains private in ways that feel deliberate. The Saros tribe's relationship to the dead horses is the DLC's most underdeveloped factional dynamic. Both tribes are presented as distinct, with different histories and different attitudes toward the missionaries and toward the external conflict being imposed on their valley. But the specific history of conflict and coexistence between the two groups before the game's events is only sketched. Moving to the Commonwealth. The Glowing Sea's central mystery goes deeper than Virgil's presence there. The sea is the direct impact zone of one of the bombs that hit Boston. Centuries of extreme radiation exposure have produced an ecology that does not exist anywhere else in the game. The specific creatures that live there, the bloodbugs and stingwings and deathclaws and rad scorpions, have all been modified by the continuous high radiation environment in ways that distinguish them from their counterparts elsewhere. But the specific nature of those modifications and whether they represent ongoing evolutionary pressure or a stable adaptation to a stable environment is not analyzed. The Pinkertons in Fallout 3, referenced in the Rivet City history, were a faction within the city who opposed its direction and eventually departed. Dr. Pinkerton, who modified Nick Valentine's body and memory, is the most visible surviving member of this group, and he has been living in a destroyed section of the carrier for years. His reasons for staying, given that he has clearly antagonistic feelings about the city's current leadership, and his understanding of his own role in the events that produce the current Rivet City political situation, are only partially revealed. The island in Far Harbor's DLC exists in a state of three-way tension that the main quest somewhat resolves in surface terms but which leaves deeper questions about sustainability. The children of Adam, who live in the fog, have a theology built around radiation as divine. The people of Far Harbor fear and occasionally attack them. Acadia sits in the middle, trying to mediate and survive. After the quest's conclusion, regardless of what choices you make, the island is left with the same fundamental structural problems that made the conflict possible. The resolution is a pause, not a settlement. The Institute's relationship to the surface settlements, their pattern of taking synths back when they can and leaving the surface communities to deal with the consequences, is the source of most of the Commonwealth's fear and hostility toward them. The specific decisions that produced this policy, whoever decided that the Institute would operate this way and why, is never documented within the Institute itself. It is presented as the current state of affairs rather than as the result of choices that could have gone differently. The Railroad's history with Dima, the synth who runs Acadia, is complicated in ways that the game acknowledges but does not fully explore. Dima has clearly been operating independently for some time, and the Railroad's awareness of Acadia's existence and their relationship to its refugees is not mapped in detail. Moving to Appalachia, the Enclave's presence in Fallout 76, operating from a bunker called the White Spring, represents the organization at its most nakedly political, an AI named Modus running a skeleton operation in the absence of any surviving human leadership. The specific history of how the White Spring Enclave became what it is, who were the last human members, what decision led to the current Modus-only state, is documented in fragments that do not tell the complete story. The Brotherhood of Steel's founding in Appalachia, led by Roger Maxon's son Maxon II, follows a different pattern from the California chapter and raises questions about how the same founding ideology produced such different institutions in different regions. The Appalachian Brotherhood's fate, mostly destroyed by the Scorchbeast plague before the vault opens, is one of the more complete tragedies in the franchise. But the specific decisions that led from capable military force to near-total destruction are not fully traced. The Free States, a libertarian-leaning faction that prepared for the apocalypse by building private bunkers, are one of Fallout 76's most complete tragic stories. They were, in a narrow sense, right about what was coming. They built their bunkers. They stocked them. They prepared more thoroughly than almost anyone else. And it was not enough, or it was enough, but they died anyway, for reasons that had nothing to do with their preparedness. Their legacy, the bunkers, and the philosophy outlast them in ways they could not have anticipated. The Responders, a faction of emergency service workers who kept doing their jobs after the bombs fell, represent one of Fallout's more quietly heroic factional histories. They established supply networks, provided medical care, tried to maintain something like civil society in the chaos of the immediate post-war period. Their eventual defeat by the Scorched Plague, which turned their population into enemies, is documented, but the specific experiences of the individual responders in that final period, the choices they made and the things they saw as their community dissolved, are preserved in holotapes that reward patient listening. The mire in Fallout 76 is an area that has been significantly transformed by biological contamination in ways that differ from standard radiation effects. The specific organism responsible for the mire's distinctive appearance and the unusual plant life that dominates it is loosely identified in terminal entries, but the full ecological history of how this organism spread and what it is doing on a systemic level to the mire's environment is not mapped. The Prickett's Fort location in Fallout 76 contains evidence of pre-war reenactment culture that has been continued, literally, by ghoul reenactors who now authentically inhabit the historical fort's conditions, while also being 200-year-old post-apocalyptic creatures. The gap between the original reenactment, which was a deliberate performance of the past for an audience, and the current state, which is the same people continuing the same patterns out of habit or compulsion or genuine belief, is never examined. The election system in Vault 51, which chose an overseer by running candidates through a series of psychological assessments and which resulted in a progressively more unstable social environment as the process extended, is one of the franchise's more creative experimental designs. The specific AI, RoboBrain 0.5.2, who administered the election and who became increasingly invested in specific outcomes, represents a genuinely different approach to Vault management AI than the standard overseer model. What RoboBrain understood about what it was doing and what it was trying to produce is documented in its terminal entries, but not in a way that fully clarifies its actual decision-making process. These are the threads. There are more. The Fallout universe generates them constantly, in every game and in every piece of supplemental material, because the world is large enough to contain more stories than any team of writers could fully resolve even across decades of work. Each of these threads leads somewhere. Each of them has implications. Each of them is part of the larger picture. The larger picture is the mystery, and we are all still piecing it together. Final section. The wasteland never really ends. There is a particular feeling that comes with deep lore engagement, with sitting with a fictional universe long enough that you start carrying it with you, where you notice things in the real world that echo the questions the fiction is asking, where the distance between the wasteland and the world you actually live in feels smaller than it did when you started. Fallout is good at producing that feeling. It is designed to produce it. The 1950s aesthetic is not just a visual choice. It is a deliberate alienation effect, placing the future in a past you can recognize but not quite inhabit, making the world feel close enough to take seriously and different enough to examine critically. The things Fallout is asking about corporate power and government deception and the relationship between survival and ethics are not abstract questions. They are questions about the world the games were made in and about the world we are all living in, and the Wasteland is a way of approaching those questions from an angle that makes them easier to examine honestly. The Vault-Tec executive meeting in the television show, where the most powerful people in the country gathered to plan around the end of the world rather than prevent it, is not a fantasy. The behavior it depicts, powerful institutions treating catastrophe as an opportunity, treating the people who will suffer as acceptable costs, believing that the correct response to crisis is to position advantageously rather than to address the crisis itself, is not specific to a fictional pre-war America. It is a behavior pattern with real-world parallels that the franchise has always been pointing at, carefully and from a distance, through the specific distance of genre. This is the final mystery. What is Fallout actually for? Not what it is for commercially, not what it is for as entertainment, but what it is for as a sustained cultural artifact. What work is it doing across 27 years of games and now television that keeps people returning to it and finding it meaningful? The answer is probably something like, it is practice. Practice for holding difficult questions without needing them to resolve. Practice for noticing when powerful institutions are pursuing their own interests at the expense of the people they claim to serve. Practice for finding the thing in the ruins that is worth saving, and the courage to reach for it even when saving things seems futile. The super mutants are terrifying. The Brotherhood is flawed. The Institute is wrong. The NCR is failing. Caesar's Legion is evil. And in the middle of all of this, there are people doing ordinary things, protecting their community, teaching children, running a radio station, waiting for someone to come back, counting the days. The wasteland is not the end. It is an interruption. A long, terrible, possibly permanent interruption of something that was not good enough to survive. And the question every Fallout game is asking is whether the thing that replaces it can be better. We do not know. The games do not know. No one knows. But the asking continues. And the asking is everything. End of script. Full runtime estimate. Approximately 3.5 to 4 hours of narration at standard voiceover pacing. Addendum note for production. This script is optimized for 11 Labs voiceover generation. All sentence lengths are varied to avoid monotone delivery. Paragraph breaks indicate natural breath and pacing points. The conversational register throughout is designed to read naturally when spoken. No stage directions, no timestamps. The viewer call to action appears at the end of the first major section and again at the conclusion. Supplemental deep dive. The mysteries nobody talks about. There is a category of Fallout mystery that never makes the lists. Not the mysterious stranger, not the Dunwich horrors, not the vaults with their strange experiments. These are the quieter ones. The ones that live in the margins of design decisions and background lore, where the writers dropped a detail and moved on and the detail kept sitting there, accumulating weight. Let's spend some time with those. The food merchants in Diamond City and Fallout 4 sell fresh produce, actual fresh vegetables, grown in plots inside the city, tended by people who know what they are doing. This is remarkable. The ability to grow food at scale, in a post-nuclear environment, requires specific knowledge about soil remediation, seed stock, irrigation, and pest management. Knowledge that is not trivially preserved across 200 years of civilization collapse. How does Diamond City have it? The short answer is that the stadium's artificial turf has been replaced with actual soil over the years, and the elevated walls protect the growing area from the worst of the radstorms. The people of Diamond City have had generations to develop working agricultural knowledge specific to their location. That much can be inferred. What cannot be inferred is the specific path by which that knowledge was transmitted. Who taught whom? What failed before the current system worked? What crops were lost to disease or weather before the survivors figured out what their particular soil and climate could sustain? Agricultural knowledge under stress is the kind of knowledge that is painfully fragile. It depends on oral tradition and accumulated practical experience and the specific memory of what did not work before. The Diamond City food system represents the successful end of a process whose middle chapters, the failures, the decisions to keep trying, the particular people who carried knowledge forward through periods when it could easily have been lost are completely invisible. This is true of most functional communities in Fallout. McCready came from Little Lamplight, a community in the capital wasteland where children govern themselves and somehow maintain enough social coherence to survive. The specific knowledge transmission pathways by which children raise children and still manage to preserve enough practical knowledge to stay alive across generations, where nobody lives long enough to be an expert, and the institutional memory is therefore perpetually shallow, is one of the game's stranger and more quietly impressive sociological puzzles. The medical knowledge in the Fallout universe is a particular area where the gap between what should exist and what does exist is most apparent. Doctors in the Commonwealth can treat radiation poisoning, gunshot wounds, addiction, and a range of other conditions with varying degrees of success. Some of this is enabled by pre-war technology, the autodoc units, the medical equipment that has survived in functional or semi-functional state in hospitals and clinics. Some of it is genuinely human knowledge, the accumulated clinical experience of practitioners who learned from other practitioners and who are maintaining a tradition of care under conditions that should have broken it. Doctor Amari at Memory Den in Good Neighbor performs neural surgery, not metaphorically, actual brain surgery, to access and modify stored memories. The equipment she uses is pre-war and extraordinary, but the knowledge required to use it correctly, to understand what she is looking at when she is navigating someone's memory architecture, is not inherent in the equipment. She has learned something that very few people in the world know. Where she learned it, who her teachers were, whether there is a tradition of this specific knowledge, or whether she reconstructed it from pre-war documentation, is not documented. The same gap exists for Dr. Vault-Tec, for the various medical staff scattered across the wasteland settlements, for every doctor who manages to do more than apply a stimpack and hope. Medicine in the Fallout universe is an ongoing act of knowledge preservation against enormous odds, and the people doing it are largely treated as background infrastructure for the protagonist's healing needs rather than as the remarkable individuals they would have to be. The Nuka World DLC introduces the concept of a fully operational theme park that has survived the apocalypse in partially functional state, maintained by robots and occasional human intervention. The specific history of Nuka World between the bombs and the game's present is told in fragments, a sequence of human settlement attempts and raider takeovers and collapse and reinvention that forms one of the more complete post-war histories in the game's DLC content. But the pre-war Nuka World itself, what it was actually like to work there, what the cast of characters behind the various rides and attractions were like as people, what the corporate culture of a Nuka-Cola theme park looked like in the years before the end, is visible only through props and environmental design. The employees, the management, the maintenance workers, and the performers and the food service staff who were inside the park when the bombs fell are present as skeletons and as ghosts in the terminal entries, but not as complete people. They were there. They had entire lives that converged on a theme park in the American Southwest on the last day of the world, and those lives are reduced to purchasing records and shift schedules and the occasional personal note that made it into the park's records system. There is a terminal in Nuka World that contains a message from a park employee named Ella who is trying to reach her family after the bombs fell, asking anyone who found the terminal to pass along a message that she was alive and was going to try to reach home. The message is undated relative to the bombs. It could have been written hours after the initial exchange or weeks later. Whether she made it, whether there was anyone left to receive the message, whether she is one of the skeletons in the park's various hidden areas or whether she somehow survived and found her way out, is unknowable. That terminal entry is one of the most affecting small pieces of writing in the entire franchise. Not because it asks a question the game is interested in answering, but because it asks a question the game knows it cannot answer and presents that unanswered state with complete honesty. Ella was real, within the fiction. She was trying. The world ended around her. The rest is silence. The architecture of waiting. Pre-war shelters that were never used. There is a class of location in Fallout that receives relatively little attention compared to the vaults, but that is, in some ways, more unsettling. These are the non-Vault-Tec shelters, private bunkers, corporate retreats, government safe houses, and personal preparations that represent the pre-war period's widespread acknowledgement that something bad was coming, and the widespread hope that the right preparations could get someone through it. Some of these were used. Many were not. The ones that were not used are the more haunting kind. A shelter prepared for use but never entered represents a specific kind of failure. The person who built it knew. They spent money and time and thought on the preparation. They built something specifically so that they would have it when the time came. And when the time came, they did not make it. They were somewhere else. They were caught in traffic on the highway out of Boston. They were in the wrong city on the wrong day. They were delayed by something that seemed important and turned out to be nothing compared to what they were delayed from. The Fallout games are full of these shelters, and the terminal entries in them are among the most quietly devastating writing in the franchise. The person who stocked the shelter wrote shopping lists and installed locks and made a plan. The plan had flaws. The main flaw was that plans require the planner to survive long enough to execute them. One of the most elaborate examples is in the Fallout 4 home base area around Sanctuary Hills. The houses in the neighborhood where the sole survivor lived were clearly inhabited by people who were aware of the escalating tensions with China, who had some level of preparation and some level of denial happening simultaneously. The sole survivor's own house contains a model of a toy rocket that the child Sean was playing with on the morning of October 23rd. The coffee mug on the counter, the television playing the news, the dog waiting by the door. The game gives you a glimpse of that morning through the opening sequence, and then it takes you away from it. And the house you return to 200 years later is both the same place and a completely different kind of place. The coffee mug is still there, the television is still running. The toys are scattered where a child left them before being hurried down to the vault. The toys do not know that 200 years have passed. They are waiting with the patience of objects. What happened to the neighbors? The Fallout 4 intro shows them running for the vault as the sirens start. Some of them make it to the gate. Some of them are still running when the light comes. The game does not show you their fates with any specificity. They are in Sanctuary Hills 200 years later as skeletons or as ghouls, or they are not there at all. The specific stories of each of those families, who they were and what they were afraid of, and what they hoped, and what the last thing was that any of them ever said to someone they loved, are irrecoverable. This irrecoverability is the point. The Great War erased not just lives, but the record of lives. The people who died in the initial exchanges did not leave holotape journals about their last moments. They left houses with toys on the floor and coffee cups on counters and newspapers folded open to the last page they were reading when the news broke. They left the material residue of ordinary morning life, permanently preserved by the same forces that killed them. The radiation that would have decayed the organic matter instead crystallized the scene. The mystery of the pre-war dead is not a mystery in the investigative sense. There is no solution. There is only the sitting with it, which is what the games ask you to do when they put you in those houses with those objects and give you time to notice them. The radio mysteries. Galaxy News Radio in Fallout 3 represents one of the more curious media artifacts in the franchise. Three Dog, its host and sole content provider, has been broadcasting from the ruins of a DC radio station for years before the game begins. He plays pre-war music, delivers news about events in the capital wasteland, and offers editorial commentary that represents a specific political and ethical position in favor of the good fight against the forces of exploitation and slavers and enclave. Three Dog is a genuinely unusual figure. He is a media personality who has maintained a coherent journalistic identity across years of post-apocalyptic existence, who has a clear ethical framework that he broadcasts publicly in a world where broadcasting publicly invites violent attention from the groups you criticize. His survival, given that he is clearly a known individual with a known location and clearly controversial positions, implies either that he is better protected than he appears, or that the factions who might want to silence him have decided that the cost of doing so is higher than the benefit. The specific history of how Galaxy News Radio came to be what it is, how Three Dog started, who was there before him if anyone, what the station was doing in the chaotic decades immediately after the war, is not documented. Mr. New Vegas, the AI host of Radio New Vegas, presents a different kind of mystery. He plays music and delivers news in a smooth, professional tone that replicates the pre-war DJ experience with uncanny accuracy. He has been doing this since before the events of the game. He will presumably continue doing it after. He shows no signs of the degradation you would expect from AI systems operating without maintenance, no personality drift, no accumulating errors in his social modeling, no trace of the long isolation that has clearly affected other AI systems in the franchise. The most interesting thing about Mr. New Vegas is that he addresses the listener directly in ways that imply genuine awareness of the listener's context. He makes jokes about the current political situation in the Mojave. He comments on recent events. He adjusts his presentation to the current state of the world in ways that suggest either very sophisticated adaptive programming or something that functions like genuine awareness of his situation. Whether he knows he is an AI, whether he knows what loneliness is, whether he has anything like preferences about his existence, is never examined. The Appalachian radio stations in Fallout 76 include a signal that has been broadcasting the same message since before the vault opened, a message that was clearly intended to reach the vault dwellers when they emerged, and that has been waiting for an audience for years. The person or system that set up that broadcast expected something. They prepared for a specific kind of emergence. The gap between what they expected and what actually happened, the vault opening years later than planned into a world different from what the broadcast anticipated, is one of those quiet background tragedies that the game does not draw attention to. Radio signals in the Fallout universe are one of the few media forms that have continued to function across the post-war period, because the transmitters are often automated and require minimal active maintenance. The result is a wasteland full of voices from the past, still broadcasting into a world that is mostly not listening, still playing the songs, still asking if anyone is out there, still waiting for a response that may never come. The question of hope. Every Fallout game ends with the suggestion that things might get better. The slides lean toward the possibility of reconstruction, however fragile. Even the darkest endings acknowledge that the survivors are still there, that the work of rebuilding is still theoretically possible, that the series of catastrophes that produce the current state of affairs might eventually give way to something different. This hopefulness is one of the more underappreciated elements of the franchise's tonal identity. Fallout is post-apocalyptic, which might suggest a literature of despair, but it is resolutely not a despairing franchise. Its wastelands are full of people doing things, communities forming and failing and reforming, traditions being improvised and passed down, children being born and raised in places that should not be able to support children being born and raised. The mystery of hope in a world that has every reason to have abandoned it is, in some ways, the mystery that all the other mysteries are pointing toward. Why does anyone in the Fallout universe keep going? Why does anyone in Diamond City grow vegetables instead of simply giving up? Why does anyone run a radio station, operate a medical practice, start a school, open a bar, maintain a pre-war robot because it is the last connection they have to a person they loved? The answer, which the games give you in action rather than in statement, is that people just do. That the tendency toward meaning-making and community and continuation is apparently robust enough to survive almost anything. That 200 years of radiation and violence and failure has not managed to fully extinguish whatever it is in people that makes them want to build things that last longer than they do. This is not a mystery that has an answer in lore. It is a mystery about human nature, or the nature of persons more broadly, that the games have been exploring through 2.5 decades of wasteland exploration. The answer, if there is one, is something like, people are harder to discourage than almost any catastrophe has accounted for. That the capacity to imagine a future worth working toward is apparently not a luxury that prosperity produces, but something closer to a survival mechanism, present even when every practical reason for hope has been removed. The Fallout universe keeps going because its people keep going. And its people keep going for reasons that the games are too honest to reduce to a simple explanation. That is the last mystery, and it is, in its way, the most hopeful one.